The story begins as the sunset falls over the trees. A blood-covered body lies on the ground, staining the grass around it. Everything Chung Myung sees is covered in red. He stands there with wide, frightened eyes, unable to understand the scene before him. A grown man lies in front of him, and Chung Myung realizes that only death remains in this place. One of his clansmen is leaning against a tree, lifeless. He cannot understand why so much blood has been spilled. A bloody sword is stuck into the ground nearby. With his shoulder wounded, Chung Myung looks back at the sword and then at the man whose arm was torn away. He remembers the fatal attack on his sect leader and the moment his comrades were killed while trying to stop their enemy. He grits his teeth until blood comes from his mouth and tightly grips his knee, thinking about everyone who died. Dozens of bodies are scattered across the battlefield. They were the final force of the elite warriors from the 9 great martial arts sects who fought against Chun Ma. Their battle ended with the destruction of almost everything around them. Blood runs down Chung Myung's chin as he wonders who is responsible for this tragedy. Sitting on a mountain of corpses is the one he believes caused everything, the demon who descended from the heavens. The founder of the heavenly demon sect, whose followers painted the world in blood. In the lotus position, Chun Ma, the founder of the demonic sect, sits calmly among the corpses. He opens his mouth and speaks about the sect. Hearing words of pity from his enemy, Chung Myung only frowns. Using his knee for support, he forces himself to stand. As soon as he rises, blood comes out with a cough. Chun Ma says that if he survives this place, he will spend the rest of his life enjoying his victory. But Chung Myung believes this is the end for both of them. He grabs his trembling leg and tells his enemy to stop talking. With countless dead bodies around them, Chun Ma acknowledges Chung Myung's swordsmanship and says that his skills prove he is the greatest follower of the sect. Chung Myung grabs the sword still stuck in his shoulder and pulls it out with force. Looking at Chun Ma with anger, he refuses to surrender. He pushes off the ground and charges forward. Chun Ma's eyes glow red as he thinks it is a shame that he will never see Chung Myung reveal his true strength. Meanwhile, Chung Myung runs across the battlefield toward the mountain of corpses. Chun Ma calmly says that this is his fate and reminds the follower of the sect that this is not the end. Chung Myung keeps moving forward, ignoring the bodies beneath his feet. Chun Ma declares that when he returns, the entire world will bow before him. The sword in Chung Myung's hand begins to shine. He swings it forward, refusing to accept that anyone can stop Chun Ma's return. His blade cuts through Chun Ma's neck, and a bright light spreads through the demon's body. Chun Ma's head separates from his body and falls to the ground, rolling down the mountain of corpses. Chung Myung takes a step forward and stands among the dead. He thinks the war is finally over. Breathing heavily, with sweat running down his face, he realizes that his own death is also approaching. As dawn begins to rise, he looks ahead and wonders what will happen to the sect now. Turning around, he looks at Chun Ma's lifeless body and thinks about all the followers of the sect who died here. The old and the young were all killed. His sword remains planted in the ground as he realizes that only the weakest children of the sect are left alive. Chung Myung looked back and wondered if the lives of the sect's followers had been a meaningless sacrifice. His hair moved with the wind as he stared at the rising dawn. He thought that if he had tried harder, maybe he could have saved at least one person. But now, everything felt meaningless. Broken weapons were scattered across the battlefield, and he collapsed among the corpses again, thinking that even plum blossoms eventually fall. He let out a heavy breath. As the steam escaped from his mouth, his expression became emotionless. He remembered that he was the 13th disciple of the greatest swordsman of the sect and one of the 3 greatest swordsmen in the world. His name was the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. Looking at Chun Ma's dead body, Chung Myung remembered that after defeating the demon who had thrown the world into chaos, he had finally fallen into eternal sleep on a mountain made of the heads of countless demons. Under the night sky, those were the last words he would leave behind in this world. A child lay in a straw cradle while 2 men looked down at him. An old man picked him up, and nearby, many disciples of the sect were training in the courtyard. Young Chung Myung stood there holding a wooden sword. His senior disciple called out to him with an angry expression, and Chung Myung felt like his entire life was flashing before his eyes. He stood calmly in front of his teacher, who reminded him that he was a Taoist first and a warrior second. Strength without the Tao was nothing more than violence. Young Chung Myung lowered his head, thinking that his teacher was complaining again. At that time, he was too proud of his natural talent and believed he deserved all the praise he received. He was a foolish person who failed to understand the teachings of the sect. His body sank into the fallen plum blossoms, and he finally realized how blind he had been. Everything he had achieved was because of the sect. The image of his teacher appeared in his mind, asking if he regretted it. Without opening his eyes, Chung Myung admitted that he regretted everything. He remembered his fallen friends and thought that if he had trained harder and become stronger, perhaps he could have changed their tragic fate. Smoke rose above the battlefield as he remembered his teacher saying that there was no reason to regret the past. No matter what happened, the sect would continue to exist. Suddenly, pain struck his body. A scream came from a small hut as someone attacked him. Chung Myung raised his hands to protect himself and thought it was another enemy. But when he opened his eyes, he saw a poorly dressed boy standing in front of him. The boy told him to stop acting strange and scolded him for sleeping there like a useless person. Chung Myung, confused, noticed that everyone else had gone somewhere while he was lying there. He looked at the stranger, holding a stick, and realized the boy was threatening him. Chung Myung told him to stop waving the stick around because he had no idea what was happening. The boy seemed offended, then suddenly laughed. Chung Myung frowned, unable to understand why this strange beggar was laughing at him. He thought he was the Plum Blossom Sword Saint, so he could not understand what this shabby-looking person was doing. The boy raised his stick and declared that Chung Myung would die today. Thinking he needed to teach this person proper manners, Chung Myung reached out to block the attack. But his eyes widened in shock. The stick did not stop. It continued toward his head because his arm was too short. Chung Myung stared in confusion. Why were his arms so small? How could he fail to block such a simple attack? The boy hit him on the head with the stick and continued scolding him, saying that since he did not understand anything, he would explain everything himself. At that moment, another child entered the shack while the ragged boy continued hitting Chung Myung, saying that if he had truly lost his mind, then this beating would help fix him. The new boy looked at the scene in fear. Hearing the cries from inside, he decided to leave and return later. Chung Myung wiped the blood from his face and sat near a pond, angrily cursing the person who attacked him. He thought that he had never received such a beating even during his days in the sect. Remembering the strange boy, he wondered what he would do if he met that little beggar again. With his feet resting in the cool water, Chung Myung stared at his reflection. He could not recognize himself. He touched his face and tried to understand what was happening. Could this really be reincarnation, the thing mentioned in Buddhist teachings? As he watched the water, someone called out to him. Chung Myung turned around and saw the boy who had escaped earlier after watching him get beaten. The boy asked if he was all right and explained that their leader was usually like this, but today he had gone too far. The boy raised one finger, saying he only had one question, then quickly raised another and corrected himself, saying he actually had two. Chung Myung looked at him seriously while the boy stared back in confusion. After a moment of silence, Chung Myung asked if he was a beggar. The boy calmly replied that anyone could tell by his clothes. Chung Myung lowered himself and complained that he had somehow become a beggar. Then he raised two fingers again and asked his second question. He looked at the boy and asked if he knew about Chun Ma. The boy looked at him with concern and wondered if the beating had affected his mind. Near the pond, Chung Myung became frustrated and asked him to answer properly. The boy crossed his arms and looked at the sky before saying that he knew who Chun Ma was. Chung Myung listened carefully as the boy explained that Chun Ma was the founder of the Heavenly Demon Sect, a demon who had died 100 years ago. Chung Myung froze. His eyes widened as he grabbed the boy's clothes and asked if it was really true that Chun Ma had died 100 years ago. He pulled the boy closer, demanding to know if he was lying. After realizing the truth, Chung Myung let go and stared forward in shock. 100 years had passed. It made no sense. Why had he been reborn immediately after his death? He felt completely lost, as if he was the only person left in the world. The boy grabbed his clothes and asked if he was really okay. Chung Myung only looked at him and thought about the sect. The beggar boy became surprised when Chung Myung suddenly asked what happened to the sect. Chung Myung was shocked when the boy did not understand what he meant. He pointed at him and asked if he really was a beggar. The boy confirmed it. Chung Myung frowned and thought that if he was a beggar, then he belonged to the Beggars Union. But he had never heard of one of the 10 great martial arts sects being called that. Where was the sect? The boy stared at him in confusion and asked what nonsense he was talking about. The boy explained, recalling the map of the martial world. The 10 great martial arts sects were Shaolin, Wudong, the Sect, Kongtong Sect, Qingchang Sect, the Lotus Order, Southern Island Sect, Kunlun Sect, and the Beggars Union. But there was no mention of the sect. Chung Myung stood there with his mouth open, unable to accept what he heard. He remembered the symbol of his sect and repeated that the sect was not among the 10 great martial arts sects. He grabbed the boy's clothes again and questioned him, saying that even other groups had joined the 10 great sects, so why had the sect disappeared? The most important thing to him was understanding why the sect no longer existed. The beggar boy tried to remember the name of the sect. Chung Myung was surprised when he heard that. After thinking about it, the boy had heard there was such a place in Shanxi province. Chung Myung stopped shaking him and confirmed that the sect was located in Shanxi province. He asked if the boy knew anything about it. The boy replied that he had never heard of the sect being one of the 10 great martial arts sections. Still holding on to the boy's clothes, Chung Myung froze when he heard that the sect had been destroyed. His thoughts raced as he remembered his home. The sect, once one of the 3 greatest sects in the world alongside Wudong and the Northern Royal Family, had actually fallen. He let go of the boy, causing the beggar to fall to the ground. Chung Myung stared in disbelief. The boy rubbed his bruised head and looked at him, while Chung Myung said that he would not believe it until he saw it himself. Clenching his fist, he declared that he was going to the sect. The beggar boy looked at him strangely, rubbed his head, and called him crazy. He told Chung Myung to leave and go beg somewhere else if he did not want another beating. Chung Myung raised a finger and said that he still had more questions and needed answers. He touched his chest and asked about the body he was in. He wanted to know the name of the person whose body he had been reborn into. The beggar boy stood up tiredly and said that he was a beggar, so he never had a proper name. He could choose any name he wanted, but his current name was Cho Sam. Chung Myung stretched his face in disappointment and said it was a fitting name for a beggar. Then he asked about his age. The boy replied that poor people usually did not know their exact age. Chung Myung waved his hand and asked one final question, the name of the person who had beaten him. The boy crossed his arms and introduced himself as Kuchul, adding that his real name was John Pal. Chung Myung looked at him seriously and promised that he would repay the favor twice and the insult tenfold. The boy looked at him without much interest and told him to remember the name Chung Myung from the sect. When they met again, he would repay his kindness properly. After saying that, Chung Myung turned and walked away. The beggar boy silently watched him. A moment later, Chung Myung turned back and asked which direction the sect was from Shanxi province. The birds flew away above the trees as Chung Myung started running. His face turned red from exhaustion. In his previous life, he had never even traveled on such a slow thing as a horse. Yet now he was struggling after only running short distance. His cheeks puffed up from the effort, but soon he collapsed on the ground. Lying face down, he thought that he was already exhausted after running such a short distance. This wee child body was far worse than he expected. He wondered how he would ever reach Shanxi province like this. Imagining his own grave, Chung Myung thought it would be ridiculous if he died on the way before even seeing the sect again. Still lying on the ground, he sighed and wondered how he would reach his destination. Then he smiled and decided that it was time for his brilliant plan. Chung Myung stood up, caught his breath, and realized that the first thing he needed was to rebuild his physical strength for martial arts. Smiling with excitement, Chung Myung thought about how ordinary people could never understand how valuable this opportunity was. Even someone who had reached the highest level of power might regret wasting such a chance. He remembered his younger days when he rested on trees instead of focusing on his foundation. He recalled how his teacher dragged him across the ground because of his laziness and how he ignored training whenever he was told to practice. He even remembered being caught drinking alcohol that he had secretly taken from his elders. Thinking about it, he smiled and admitted that he did not regret that part. Walking through the forest, Chung Myung decided to try again. He needed a quiet place where he could avoid distractions. Finding a suitable spot beside a tree, he sat down and entered a calm state. His mind contained countless theories about advanced martial arts techniques. The history and teachings of the sect were still stored in his memories. He knew many breathing techniques for cultivating qi, and outside of the sect methods, he had studied even more. As the wind moved through the trees, a leaf fell beside him. Chung Myung decided to begin with another technique. His eyes widened as he remembered the 6 interactions breathing technique. He recalled seeing books about it being sold cheaply in the streets, sometimes for only a few hundred coins. A technique like this seemed worthless to ordinary people. But Chung Myung knew the truth. The 6 interactions breathing technique was the foundation of the sect's teachings. Every new disciple began their path with this method. Although it did not immediately increase strength, it purified the body and created a stable foundation. Chung Myung understood that building power was like constructing a great tower. There was no need to rush because the foundation determined how strong the final result would become. Blue energy began flowing through his veins as he purified the qi inside his body. The light traveled throughout him, removing the unstable energy like separating unwanted threads from a large piece of cloth. The purified energy gathered inside his dantian, forming a stable source of power. A bright glow appeared inside his body. Chung Myung smiled and moved his hands, realizing he had succeeded. The dantian would become the foundation that opened the way toward a new level of power. However, his small body quickly became tired. He thought that although he was weak now, he was still full of potential. Like a snowball rolling down a mountain, his growth would become unstoppable. He wondered if he could finally run toward the sect. Taking his first step, he immediately fell down again. Lying face down in the grass, he realized that he had used up all his energy. He complained that the technique was useless because he wanted to use his power right away. At that moment, the image of his teacher seemed to appear in his mind. His teacher scolded him for always acting before thinking. Meanwhile, in the nearby town, people walked through the market streets. 2 men entered an alley and approached another man resting there. When they called him elder, he opened his eyes. They pointed toward a child nearby and explained that a little beggar had been taking their money, leaving them with nothing. The elder slowly stood up and decided that the child needed to be taught a lesson. His followers agreed and followed behind him. Not far away, Chung Myung was eating a bun when he heard someone calling him. He ignored them and continued eating, even as the voices became more aggressive. Finally, Chung Myung turned back to the men. Still chewing his food, he asked what they wanted. The elder stepped forward and questioned his attitude toward elders. He warmed up his fists and said he did not know who allowed a child to beg in that area. However, since Chung Myung was still young, he would let it go. He only needed to hand over the food in his hand and everything he had collected that day. Chung Myung froze and looked at the bun in his hand. The men prepared themselves as he asked why they wanted to take away food that had already been bitten. He wondered if beggars truly had no shame. Standing up, Chung Myung brushed away the crumbs and prepared himself, surprising the men. He suddenly threw a punch. Afterward, he looked at his hand in surprise and realized his dantian had not fully recovered yet. Still, he believed this was enough. Turning toward his opponents, he said that he now understood how to control this body, but he was too tired to deal with them one by one, so they should attack all together. The elder trembled with anger, but also noticed Chung Myung was not in perfect condition. He assumed the boy was bluffing and ordered his men to attack. One of them rushed forward. His punch missed as Chung Myung easily dodged. The next moment, Chung Myung struck him directly in the jaw. Everyone froze as their companion fell. Chung Myung's fist still carried force as he looked at the remaining men and declared that he was the Plum Blossom Sword Saint of the sect. Soon, the beaten men were kneeling before him. Leaning against a wall, Chung Myung told them to address him properly. When they corrected themselves and called him a great beggar, he became annoyed that they were still calling him a beggar. After dusting off his hands, he asked if they knew a fast way to reach Shaanxi province. The elder looked at him in disbelief and said that if they knew such useful information, they would not still be living as beggars. Chung Myung smiled and realized they had misunderstood each other. He laughed, and the beggars nervously laughed along with him. The next moment, Chung Myung grabbed the elder by the clothes and pulled him closer. He warned him that if they met again and he asked a question, they had better answer clearly if they wanted to survive. The elder's expression immediately changed with fear. The beggars quickly stood up and ran away. Later, the mountains were covered in mist. Inside a room, a man looked out the window with a smile. When someone called him, he turned around. The door opened, and Unam entered. Unam explained that nothing unusual had happened, but a child wanted to meet him. The man was surprised and asked again about the child. Soon, Chung Myung stood before him with his hands politely folded. Smiling, he introduced himself and said that he wanted to join the sect. The man looked at him carefully and repeated that he wanted to become a disciple of the sect. He then turned to Unam and asked if he had explained that they were not accepting new disciples. Unam replied that he had tried to stop him, but the child insisted on meeting him. Both of them looked back at Chung Myung, who was still smiling politely. Although his smile looked calm, Chung Myung was actually furious. To understand why, they had to look back a little earlier. His staff hit the ground as Chung Myung leaned on it. He finally arrived. In front of him were the stairs leading toward the sect. He frowned, thinking that the shortcut shown by the beggars had not helped much, but after all the effort, he had finally reached his destination. The staff lifted from the ground, and leaning on it, Chung Myung decided to continue upward. He climbed the mountain steps, forcing his tired body forward. His breathing became heavy, but he refused to stop. Grabbing onto a rocky ledge, Chung Myung pulled himself higher. Loose stones rolled down beneath him, but he continued climbing. Looking down for a moment, he reminded himself that nothing was impossible with enough determination. He tightened his grip on the staff and reached for the next rock, thinking that he would reach the sect no matter what. Finally, Chung Myung climbed over the rocks and looked ahead. But his expression changed. The sign that should have been there was gone. He waved his hands in disbelief and wondered where it had disappeared to. He remembered how carefully the sign was maintained every morning and could not understand how it was missing. Standing at the entrance, Chung Myung complained that this situation was enough to drive anyone crazy. The gate suddenly opened. A man appeared and asked who had come. Chung Myung looked at him carefully, while the man stared at the boy in surprise. He asked if he had come alone and wondered how a child had managed to climb the mountain by himself. Chung Myung looked at him with wide eyes and said he wanted to ask something. The man watched him with interest. Chung Myung asked if he was a Taoist from the sect. The man confirmed that he was. Hearing this, Chung Myung became relieved. At least the sect had not completely disappeared. When the man invited him inside, Chung Myung followed. Near the training ground, the man explained that they were not accepting new disciples at the moment. However, since the child had managed to climb the mountain, they could not simply leave him outside. Unam explained that the mountain became extremely cold at night. Chung Myung looked around the training ground in surprise. He noticed the damaged surface and wondered why the once beautiful stone flooring had been replaced with ordinary dirt. Seeing his reaction, Unam asked what was wrong. Chung Myung smiled awkwardly, reminding himself to stay calm. Perhaps the sect had simply sold things because they needed money. But his eyes continued searching. He noticed many things were missing. He wondered where the grand golden palace had gone and why the area looked so empty. Unam admitted that there had once been a palace there. Chung Myung thought that he already knew that and wanted to know where it had disappeared. Unam looked at him carefully and said that he was too young to understand the story. He admitted that it was painful to remember. The sect had suffered greatly, but what was gone could never return. Chung Myung was surprised by his words, but he did not explain. Unam simply told him to follow because he had something to show him. As they walked, Unam thought that the sect was not at fault. They were only struggling to preserve what remained of their dying sect. Soon, Unam and Chung Myung stood before the Jade Palace. Unam reached for the door and explained that the sect was a place of Taoism, so certain traditions had to be respected before entering. They entered the Jade Palace. Chung Myung looked around with disappointment. Everything he remembered was gone. He thought about the precious items that once existed there, the golden candlestick gifted by the emperor, the scroll written by the great monk, and other treasures. He searched the room and noticed more things missing. When he reached the altar, his expression changed. He asked if a certain flower had once been placed there and turned to Unam, asking where it had gone. Unam looked surprised and wondered how the boy knew about it. Chung Myung stared back in shock when Unam explained that there had indeed been such a flower. It was a strange plum blossom made of white metal. Unam smiled sadly and explained that they had sold it. Chung Myung's expression immediately fell. He heard that the flower had no practical use and only stood out from the rest of the decoration. Since a merchant offered a good price for it, they decided to sell it. Chung Myung slowly fell to his knees. He remembered the sect and thought about how far it had fallen. The white plum blossom, one of the sect's treasures, was not something that shined like gold or silver. It was a small relic that carried the pure spirit of the sect, and they had sold it. Unam quickly rushed toward him and asked if he was all right. He thought he needed to calm the situation as soon as possible. Chung Myung pushed himself up from the floor and bowed deeply. He asked to meet the sect leader. With another deep bow, he said that he wanted to enter the sect. Soon, Chung Myung stood before the elders. The sect leader looked at him and asked if he truly understood what the sect was. Chung Myung calmly confirmed that he did. He frowned slightly, thinking that the leader would not accept a stranger so easily. However, he already had a plan prepared. With confidence, Chung Myung introduced himself and created a story about his past. He claimed that he was a disciple who had gone missing during the war. According to his story, he had fallen from a mountain and was found by a passing lumberjack. The lumberjack saved him and took care of him while he recovered. Because of his gratitude, Chung Myung said that the lumberjack accepted him as a disciple and taught him the sect's techniques. That was how he learned their martial arts. Chung Myung smiled, satisfied with his explanation. In his mind, he calculated the relationship between himself and the leader. If this lumberjack was considered his ancestor, then his position would be much closer to the leader. It was a perfect plan. However, he wondered if the leader would question such a young person appearing suddenly. Before he could continue, the sect leader sighed and accepted him. Chung Myung looked shocked and asked him to repeat it. The leader smiled and said that if the child truly wished to enter, he would allow it. Unam looked surprised and reminded the leader of his earlier words about not accepting new disciples. But the leader replied that he had changed his mind. Fate was unpredictable. Chung Myung stood there speechless, wondering why the leader showed no suspicion at all. The leader stepped forward and explained that this child clearly knew about the sect and had come all this way for a reason. He said that just as one should not turn away a bird seeking shelter from rain or reject an animal searching for warmth during winter, they should not abandon someone who came to them. Unam bowed and asked if he should prepare the initiation. The leader agreed. Chung Myung frowned, dissatisfied. His imagined relationship plan completely collapsed. Later, Chung Myung wore the uniform of a third-generation disciple and looked at his surroundings. He wondered what had happened to him. The room seemed to be a guest room, but it appeared to be used as a temporary residence for new disciples before they completed their training. He thought about how the sect never used such arrangements before. After closing the door, Chung Myung decided that someone must live here anyway. Suddenly, he stopped when someone called out to him. He turned around and saw an older disciple standing there. The disciple asked who he was and why he was entering someone else's room. Then he accused him of being a thief. Hearing the commotion, more disciples gathered in the corridor to see what was happening. The disciple who stopped Chung Myung explained that the child had been sneaking around inside his room. The other students looked at the scene in confusion and wondered what was happening in the corridor. Just then, their teacher appeared and asked why they were making a disturbance when training was not even finished. The students immediately bowed and apologized. The teacher then looked at Chung Myung and asked who he was. Chung Myung introduced himself. The teacher frowned and realized he was a new disciple staying in the White Plum Blossom house. Turning away, he told him it was late and that he should rest. He also reminded him to attend training the next day. Chung Myung watched the students leave and heard the others being ordered downstairs. The disciple who had stopped him looked back and warned him that they would settle things later. He promised that Chung Myung would receive a proper beating from him. After everyone left, Chung Myung stood alone in the hallway. He thought that since these students were his successors, he would personally pay attention to their training. Of course, his meaning of paying attention was very different from theirs. The moon rose above the sect. The disciple who had bullied him earlier appeared again and smiled. He ordered Chung Myung to remove his clothes. Chung Myung stared at him in confusion and asked what he meant. The disciple insisted that he should not pretend and demanded that he take them off. He joked that this was how men became closer and that a beating would strengthen the bond between senior and junior disciples. Chung Myung frowned and asked if he had finished. Then he asked where Unam was. The disciple replied that Unam had already stopped training for the day. Looking down on him, the disciple decided that Chung Myung talked too much and prepared to teach him another lesson. Before he could continue, someone called out. Chung Myung looked at him and told him to prepare himself. He did not want to waste time, but a fist suddenly struck his face. The impact was powerful enough to shake the roof. The other students looked up in surprise. But instead of Chung Myung falling, the senior disciple was thrown into the air. Chung Myung looked at his fist and smiled, saying that the lesson had finally begun. The other disciples immediately became nervous. Soon, they were all kneeling before him. Chung Myung told them they needed to put more effort into their training, and said he was only helping because their senior had promised to guide them properly. Even the older disciple lowered his head. Chung Myung waved him over and asked him to come closer. He admitted that he did not fully understand what had happened to the sect during the last 100 years, so he had several questions. The disciple promised to answer. Chung Myung asked what had happened to the sect's treasures and why the sect had fallen into such a state. The disciple hesitated. Then Chung Myung asked if he knew anything about the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. The disciple explained that according to the elders, the Plum Blossom Sword Saint had played a major role in defeating Chun Ma. However, after that victory, the heavenly demon sect went into chaos and their remaining forces attacked the sect. The warriors reached their mountain and destroyed it. Because of the damage from that battle, the sect was never able to return to its former glory. Chung Myung listened in shock. He realized that the reason the sect had declined was connected to him. A drop of sweat ran down his face. He looked up, feeling frustrated that everything he had fought for had led to this. The next morning, sunlight filled the mountain. A disciple explained that the sword technique they practiced lacked proper Taoist foundations and was extremely weak without them. Chung Myung listened while eating and wondered why they thought removing the sect's techniques would not cause problems. Chung Myung smiled and replied that this sword technique was terrible. It was not even worth keeping, so they should just throw it away. The elder explained that although removing it might cause some trouble, because it was an ancestral technique, there was no reason to keep teaching something that did not help the disciples. He suggested taking it out of the library. Chung Myung continued eating while the elder turned to his student and agreed that it sounded reasonable. As plum blossoms fell from the tree, the elder mentioned that there was something else they needed to discuss. Sitting across from Chung Myung, he explained that he had not called him over only for that matter. He believed it was time for Chung Myung to take responsibility for his own disciples and asked how he planned to train them. Chung Myung froze. He squeezed the cookie in his hand. When the elder asked what he was thinking, Chung Myung calmly answered that it was simple. First, he would beat them. Once they reached the edge of life and death, they would break through their limits. Silence filled the room. After that day, the elder never suggested giving Chung Myung any disciples again. Later, Chung Myung rested on a wooden bench when someone called him. He asked not to be spoken to so formally. The disciple explained that Unam was calling him to the training ground and that he had to attend today's training. On the training ground, the disciples stood in rows. Their instructor shouted for them to prepare their swords. The disciples raised their wooden swords and repeated the movements. The instructor became frustrated and told them again to swing properly. Unam and Chung Myung watched from the side. Chung Myung looked confused and asked what kind of sword technique they were practicing. Unam explained that it was the balanced sword technique. Chung Myung listened as he learned that this technique was considered the foundation of the sect's swordsmanship. His expression changed. This was supposed to be the foundation? He thought that teaching this to young disciples was like making someone learn complicated books before teaching them the alphabet. It would only slow their growth. Chung Myung walked through the rows of students. He watched their movements and thought that this technique would only allow them to advance slightly. It gave almost no real benefit. The senior disciple continued practicing. Chung Myung looked up at the sky as plum blossoms drifted down. The sky was clear and peaceful, just like the true spirit of the sect. He watched silently, wondering where he should even begin. Then he called out to the senior disciple. The disciple looked nervous as Chung Myung asked what exactly they were teaching. The disciple explained that after the balanced sword technique, they learned the seven-sword sage technique, then the plum blossom sword technique, and finally the secret techniques. Chung Myung sighed. The disciple tightened his grip on his sword and explained that their final technique was the Tai Hua plum sword technique. Chung Myung remembered the elder saying that this technique lacked a proper Taoist foundation and was extremely weak. Still chewing, Chung Myung said that this sword technique was not very useful and perhaps they should discard it too. His expression became disappointed. He thought that the technique they were teaching was the Tai Hua plum sword technique, but what happened to the 24 plum blossom sword technique? One of the disciples noticed the conversation and said they should report it. The night covered the sect. Later, Saji turned when Chung Myung called him. Chung Myung waved his hand and asked him not to be so formal. He calmly asked Unam for a favor. Saji scratched his head and listened as Chung Myung told him to gather everyone in front of the white plum blossom house at 5 in the morning. Then Chung Myung told him to listen carefully. Everyone needed to prepare 5 specific items. Saji awkwardly scratched the back of his head and admitted that he really needed to prepare everything. Chung Myung smiled and asked if he could handle it. Saji confidently replied that he could rely on him. As Saji turned away, Chung Myung calmly watched him leave. His expression became thoughtful. The current state of the sect worried him. They had no proper techniques, no wealth, and no talented disciples. It was no surprise that the sect had declined so badly. He imagined the 3 important foundations of a sect: resources, techniques, and talent. The only thing he could help with was talent. But when he looked at the current disciples, they did not seem talented at all. For a moment, he doubted himself. Still, he remembered that even a journey of 1,000 miles began with a single step. He watched the departing Saji and decided that his first goal would be improving these useless senior disciples. Meanwhile, the senior disciples left the building. They complained that no junior disciple should be able to summon his seniors whenever he wanted. Saji looked at them and wondered if they were serious. It seemed they were not aware of what had happened the previous night. When they realized they were talking about Chung Myung, they became annoyed. Soon, Chung Myung stood surrounded by the senior disciples. They questioned why he had forced them to wake up so early and demanded an explanation. Chung Myung sighed. Then he suddenly smiled and turned toward them. He apologized, saying that there must have been a misunderstanding. He gently pushed the angry disciples toward the dormitory and suggested they discuss everything inside. The seniors entered the building, and Chung Myung followed. The doors closed. For a moment, everything became quiet. Then the dormitory started shaking. Saji looked at the building in concern as the shaking became stronger. Suddenly, the doors opened. The exhausted senior disciples stumbled out and lined up in front of Chung Myung. Chung Myung calmly asked them to stay quiet, warning that they might wake the sect leader. He stepped forward and announced that training would happen every morning at the same time. The mountains were illuminated by the morning sun. Inside his room, the leader woke up and looked outside. He wondered why the disciples had not come to greet him as usual and realized everyone was still sleeping. He got dressed, remembering that they had recently accepted a new disciple. He assumed the students were simply tired after the initiation ceremony. Walking outside, he thought that he needed to teach them a proper lesson. Even if Jogul was strict, he should not push the disciples too hard. But when he reached the training ground, he stopped in surprise. The students were lying exhausted on the ground. Sasek stared at them, confused. A drop of sweat ran down his face as he asked what had happened. The senior disciples looked at each other and stayed silent. They did not dare explain. Meanwhile, Saji walked forward carrying a sword, looking completely exhausted. Behind him was Chung Myung. The boy had tied heavy stones to his back as training weights. He sat down with his cheeks puffed out from the effort, trembling while carrying the weight. Counting calmly, Chung Myung continued his exercise. When he reached 10,085, he noticed the leader standing in front of him. Even while carrying the heavy stones, Chung Myung greeted him politely. The great Sasek looked at the heavy stones tied to Chung Myung's back and carefully examined their weight and the boy's condition. He noticed that Chung Myung's legs were trembling simply from standing there. The leader immediately shouted at the other disciples to bring him water. But Chung Myung calmly held the training weights with one hand, scratched his head, and said there was no need to worry. When he received the water, he quickly drank it, spilling some in his hurry. The leader looked at him and asked what exactly had happened. He turned toward the training ground. Many disciples were lying on the ground, completely exhausted. Some were begging for help, while others had already passed out. Chung Myung waved his hand casually and said it was nothing special. This was just morning training, and from today onward, they would practice like this every day. However, since it was their first day, everyone had pushed themselves too much. The leader looked at the exhausted disciples, wondering if they had agreed to this willingly. The disciples immediately shook their heads. Saji and Chung Myung looked at them. The leader realized the disciples were not tired because of normal training, but because they were afraid of this new disciple. He became annoyed. How could they call themselves disciples of the sect and still fear a newcomer? He cleared his throat and decided to correct Chung Myung. While the boy was still drinking water, the leader seriously asked who gave him permission to sacrifice everyone's sleep for training. Chung Myung stood there holding the cup, surprised by the serious tone. Then he smiled and promised to stop. The leader was confused because this was not the reaction he expected. He wanted to continue scolding him, but then he realized that such an approach would only make the senior disciples look worse. Covering his face, he thought that the third-generation disciples already looked ridiculous for being pushed around by a new disciple. And now he looked even more ridiculous for teaching them. Before he could say anything else, Chung Myung requested 1 month. He asked the leader to give him only 1 month of training. With confidence, he promised that the results would be obvious. Looking at the senior disciples slowly standing up, Chung Myung praised them. He said that even though the training was difficult, none of them complained. Then he turned to them and asked if he was right. The exhausted disciples, barely able to stand, agreed. The leader looked at Chung Myung and realized what he meant. They were not complaining because they respected their junior. He wondered where this child came from and how he had managed to control the senior disciples so quickly. Chung Myung smiled and explained why he wanted them to train every morning. He told the disciples that they could become stronger by learning from their masters, but they could improve even faster by putting in more effort themselves. Turning toward the leader, he explained that giving up a little sleep for training was worth it. The leader listened carefully. He understood why Chung Myung valued training so much. Looking at the boy and the disciples behind him, he asked what was the most important thing. Chung Myung answered immediately. Respect. The leader listened as Chung Myung explained that the words of elders should be treated with great importance. He was surprised. He realized that Chung Myung was not insulting the elders. He was using respect as a way to help everyone improve. The leader smiled. He realized that this child was exactly the kind of disciple the sect needed. Turning toward the exhausted students, he announced that he was impressed by their determination to participate in morning training. The disciples looked shocked. The leader declared that if they continued with this effort, they would achieve results beyond their expectations. One of the exhausted disciples tried to ask the leader for help, but the man quickly left before he could finish. The disciples stretched out their hands toward him, desperately calling for him to return. Meanwhile, Chung Myung calmly stretched his arms. Seeing their reaction, he smiled and invited his seniors to talk in the dormitory, assuring them that he had no intention of doing anything dangerous. The disciples froze and looked at him nervously. Chung Myung happily called them over for a discussion, but the only response he received was their tired groans. A few days later, Chung Myung sat in his room meditating. A faint energy surrounded his body as he focused. Although his dantian was still small and weak, it gave him a feeling of stability. During this time, he had learned more about the current state of the sect. The White Plum Blossom House was no longer like the Great Sect he remembered. It had become closer to a simple residence because there were too few disciples and masters to properly maintain the traditions. He remembered the relationship between master and disciple and the importance of that bond. However, when he compared the current masters to the past of the sect, he could only consider them weak. Their strength was nowhere near what the sect had once possessed. Thinking about the disciples, he realized the situation was even worse. Many third-generation disciples had joined only to build connections rather than truly pursue martial arts. Continuing his meditation, Chung Myung wondered if anything had really changed. Then he opened his eyes. The great Chung Myung had returned. He slowly stood up and decided that rebuilding the sect was not impossible. In the dining hall, the disciples gathered for lunch. One disciple's hands were shaking so badly that he could barely hold his chopsticks. The food slipped from his hand and fell onto the table. He complained that training should not be so extreme that they could not even eat properly. He turned toward the senior disciple, asking Gul to speak with Chung Myung because he had been unable to use chopsticks properly for 3 days because of the training. Gul closed his eyes and sighed. The disciples were surprised when he told them they were complaining too much. Putting down his chopsticks, Gul asked if he looked like someone who ran errands for them. The disciples became quiet. Only Zhang continued eating. Gul explained that if they had a problem with Chung Myung, they should speak to him directly instead of complaining behind his back. One disciple stood up and asked Gul for a private conversation. Gul agreed. Under the warm lights of the building, the two walked deeper into the Plum Blossom Garden. Zhang asked Gul if he had rested well. Gul shook his head and looked at the sky. When Zhang asked what he thought about the sect, Gul hesitated. He admitted that it was a difficult question. Gul explained that once he returned to his hometown, his time here would end, but Zhang's situation was different. Zhang nodded. He planned to spend his entire life in the sect. After a moment of silence, Gul lowered his gaze and admitted that he once thought the sect was finished. Zhang immediately told him to show more respect and not say such things so casually. But Gul changed his mind after remembering Chung Myung. Since Chung Myung arrived, everything had changed. He remembered the painful training and admitted that although it was harsh, he had never pushed himself that far before. Then he remembered Chung Myung carrying 2 huge boulders while acting as if it was nothing. Compared to that, their own training seemed small. Gul clenched his fists and said that he wanted to reach that level. He turned and said that he would work hard until he became a master whose name would be known throughout the world. Zhang smiled. Under the falling plum blossoms, he told his friend that he had the same goal. Meanwhile, Chung Myung watched the entire conversation from the branch of a plum tree. He leaned back comfortably and smiled, thinking that these two were finally showing some determination. Unam had also accepted his words without hesitation, but Chung Myung knew there was still a lot left to do. Just then, his thoughts were interrupted by loud voices coming from the sect gate. Someone was demanding that the sect leader come out. Chung Myung narrowed his eyes in confusion. A group of people was aggressively knocking on the gates, demanding entry. The gates opened, and several merchants entered the sect grounds carrying torches. They loudly called for the sect leader. The commotion stopped when Unam and Sasek appeared with a nervous expression and explained that such behavior was unacceptable inside the sect. Watching from the plum tree, Chung Myung wondered how these people had managed to enter through the gates and what exactly was happening. The merchants complained that they had waited long enough and there was no more time. They demanded that their money be returned. Chung Myung was surprised. He wondered how the sect had ended up in such a situation. The men near the entrance shouted that their leader had no shame for hiding instead of coming out. After they called again, the old man finally appeared at the door, drawing everyone's attention. Chung Myung peeked from behind the group as the leader calmly asked what brought them to such a remote place so late at night. Seeing him, Chung Myung no longer had any doubts. This was indeed the head of the sect. As Chung Myung observed him, he noticed that even his smallest movements and words carried a faint aura. His eyes briefly moved to the old man's legs while the merchants questioned why he was pretending to remain calm. Chung Myung understood that the man was simply maintaining appearances. The leader raised a hand and greeted the visitor. The owner responded politely, and the old man admitted that he had not expected the owner of Kong Pavilion himself to come all the way here. The owner laughed awkwardly and explained that he had no desire to climb the mountain again, but many people had pushed him to make the visit. The old man lowered his head and listened as the guests reminded him that the agreed deadline had already passed. Khan explained that they had already been patient and that according to the contract, the amount owed should have increased by half by now. However, because the sect had saved their lives many times before, they had tried to handle the matter gently. The owner then gave a final deadline of 7 days and stated that if payment was not made by then, they would confiscate the sect's temple. At that moment, someone hiccuped. Everyone turned around. Someone quietly remarked that it seemed inappropriate to let a child hear such things. From the temple roof, a voice asked whether they were merchants from Wan Prefecture. One of the companions raised his hand and confirmed it. Chung Myung covered his face and looked away, realizing he had no idea what the boy might do next, and deciding it was safer to stay back. Gul asked whether Wan Prefecture was the village below the mountain, and his companion confirmed it, saying he remembered visiting there while trading with his father. A disciple then asked whether that meant the sect had borrowed money from merchants. The reply came that he did not know the details, but he did know the owner of Kong Pavilion. The explanation followed that the man was the owner of Taiwa Pavilion in Wan Prefecture, the largest pavilion in the region, a wealthy merchant involved in many affairs. Hearing this, Chung Myung asked if that meant the man truly owned Tua Pavilion. The disciples were stunned. One companion tried to calm everyone down, but the reaction only became stronger. Chung Myung suddenly remembered that the pavilion actually belonged to the sect. Without hesitation, he grabbed one of his companions by the clothes and asked whether that merchant truly owned the pavilion and whether he intended to seize the sect's temple simply because of a loan. The companion confirmed it. After letting go, Chung Myung felt that something about the situation did not make sense. Standing among the others, he realized it was strange that Kong had been the first to offer money to the sect. Lowering his head, he came to the conclusion that this entire situation had been planned. Turning back to his companions, Chung Myung asked whether they remembered the conversation from earlier and whether the requested item had been brought. The disciple looked confused, and Chung Myung frowned as he reminded him what they had been discussing. As he rushed off, his companion shouted that he would bring it immediately. When he returned holding the item, he asked what Chung Myung intended to do with it. Chung Myung removed his clothes and explained that there was a saying in Buddhist teachings. As he changed into the outfit, he reflected that if one meets the Buddha, one must kill the Buddha, and if one meets one's ancestor, one must kill the ancestor as well. Adjusting his sleeves, he added that reaching the highest level of Tao sometimes required going against the path itself. Placing his hands on his hips, Chung Myung declared that he was going to search for the true path. His two companions stared in confusion and questioned where he intended to go dressed like that and whether he was seriously planning to leave the temple. Ignoring them, Chung Myung leaped over the wall while they called him insane. In the distance, the city and its tall tower came into view. Meanwhile, the merchants sat together and talked about how the leader of the sect had looked completely troubled despite being given one final opportunity. One of them pointed out that the debt had already exceeded 100,000 yuan. Another asked whether it was true that the old man had been surprised to see Khan personally accompany them. The owner smiled and admitted that although he was a merchant who pursued profit, he regretted having to do this because the relationship between them had lasted for generations. Another merchant praised him, saying he had already done more than enough and had made countless concessions to the sect, so people would only admire his generosity. Khan lifted his drink and said he hoped that would be true. As he drank, he thought about how carefree the others around him were and how surprising it was that people could live so simply. Setting down his cup, he reflected that the sect's strength should never be underestimated. Its real value was not its martial power, but its long history. As he reached for the food, Kong thought that there was almost no one in Shaanxi province without some connection to the sect. Tearing apart the duck with his chopsticks, he realized that the sect had become weak and compared them to the soft skin breaking under pressure. One merchant then asked what they planned to do with the Manhwa temple and whether confiscating it made sense when selling it would be difficult. Smiling, the advisor questioned why they would settle for something smaller. The owner closed his eyes and explained that the temple's value was far greater than anyone imagined. Although it looked old, it was worth far more than it appeared. When the others failed to understand, Kong silently thought about how short-sighted they were. He finally explained that they could use the sect's enemies to their advantage. Many sects would gladly spend enormous amounts to restore the temple if it also meant destroying the sect. The merchants listened in surprise as he assured them that everyone would receive their share. One of them stood up and praised the owner's insight. Drinks were poured, and everyone raised their cups in celebration. Later, one of the advisors walked down the street feeling satisfied. Staggering slightly, he thought that if they managed to pull money from the sect, the amount would support him for the rest of his life, because the pavilion owner never handled money carelessly. Under the cloudy night sky, he noticed the bright moon and then realized he could not actually see it, assuming it was simply a new moon. As he continued along the street, he thought that he should walk outside at times like this more often. Then he suddenly opened one eye. A blurry figure stood ahead. He focused and opened both eyes. Chung Myung was standing in front of him. With a serious expression, Chung Myung ordered him to stop. Rubbing his cheek, the advisor looked at the small figure in front of him and thought he resembled the kind of robber drawn in old illustrations. He wondered whether robbers actually dress like this and whether they openly announce themselves. Crossing his arms, he asked whether the stranger was a robber. Chung Myung explained that he had no interest in money and only wanted answers to a few questions. If he received them, the man would leave unharmed. The advisor replied that it was not that he refused to answer, but that he had little choice. As he mentioned that he currently had many companions with him, several fighters suddenly appeared around him. Chung Myung immediately recognized them as high-level bodyguards. One of them asked whether they should eliminate the robber, but the merchant decided they should hear him out first and ordered them to capture him without preventing him from speaking. Turning away, the advisor thought that he disliked scenes of violence and assumed his guards would handle everything. Then his eyes widened. He turned around in confusion, wondering whether they had not been told to leave the robber alive. Chung Myung was already standing there holding the final fighter. After throwing the body aside, he remarked that people should listen when instructions are given, though some never do. He gestured for the merchant to come closer. Standing in front of him, Chung Myung repeated that if he answered the questions honestly, he would leave without injury and asked whether the conditions were understood. The advisor quickly agreed. Chung Myung grabbed him by the clothes and remarked that things would have stayed simple if he had answered from the beginning instead of resisting. He assured him that he would still remain capable of speaking. Some time later, the man's face was covered in bruises. Chung Myung asked whether he was finally prepared to speak properly, and the advisor agreed to tell everything truthfully. Crossing his arms, Chung Myung asked whether it was true that the sect had borrowed more than 100,000 yang. The man confirmed it. Chung Myung called him out and pointed out that even if he stripped the merchant of everything now, there would not be 100,000 left, not even 10,000. He questioned how a nearly collapsed sect could possibly have borrowed that amount. The advisor explained that it was because of interest. They had lent the money at extremely high rates, and once repayment failed, the interest kept growing until the original amount became insignificant. Chung Myung struck him again and questioned whether he was actually proud of that. The merchant collapsed to the ground. Chung Myung then asked whether he owned the cotton shop. The advisor answered yes. Chung Myung asked when he had acquired it, and the man claimed that the shop had belonged to his family for generations. But Chung Myung immediately knew that could not be true. From his knowledge of the city, he remembered that the shop had originally been one of the sect's businesses. In fact, all of the profitable businesses in this area had belonged to the sect. Thanks to them, Hain had grown from a forgotten village into a county. As the sect declined, those entrusted with management had most likely taken control for themselves. While thinking through everything, Chung Myung continued pressuring the man. Then he suddenly turned. Someone had called out to him. A surviving fighter stood up and accused him of attacking from behind. Holding the hilt of his sword, the man judged from Chung Myung's skill that he was far from an ordinary martial artist and demanded to know who he was. The bodyguard stepped forward and introduced himself confidently, believing the young man should recognize his name. After releasing the merchant, Chung Myung casually apologized for not knowing him and questioned what difference knowing his identity would make. The guard responded that a swordsman should at least know who would fall beneath his blade. Chung Myung calmly remarked that he had recently seen someone collapse from a single strike. The swordsman frowned at what he considered arrogant behavior and slowly drew his sword. Without hesitation, he rushed forward and demanded that Chung Myung defend himself. Jongbin charged in with full force. Standing still, Chung Myung understood that the man likely came from an influential family, but comparing skill, speed, and strength alone was meaningless. His sword lay nearby as he reflected that being stronger physically did not automatically mean being stronger overall. The weapon returned to his hand. In the next moment, he deflected the incoming attack. The opponent's expression changed immediately. Holding back the blade, Chung Myung understood that the difference between them was experience. He still carried the memories of the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. Knowing raw strength was insufficient, he redirected the opponent's power instead. The swordsman was thrown backward. Chung Myung slightly rotated the blade and launched a strike. At that moment, plum blossom petals seemed to scatter around the battlefield. The opponent stared in shock as Chung Myung told him to train more and return later. Using the 24 plum blossom sword technique, Chung Myung passed through him. The sword dropped to the ground. As Chung Myung lowered his weapon, he remarked that people should understand their place. Then he heard someone cry out in disbelief. Turning around, he realized he had completely forgotten about the advisor. At that moment, Chung Myung regretted revealing his sword style. The merchant slowly opened one eye. Chung Myung wondered whether he had recognized the technique since he had even formed the plum blossom bud. But instead of recognizing it, the man praised the swordsmanship as refined and exciting, claiming he had even sensed a subtle freshness within it. Chung Myung stared in confusion and wondered where such a conclusion had come from. Then the merchant suddenly asked whether the young man had arrived from Jong-un. They looked at each other in silence. After a brief pause, Chung Myung simply agreed. The merchant then promised to answer every question. Later, under the cloudy sky and among the mountains, two disciples waited outside the door. Gul nervously bit his nail and asked where Chung Myung could be. His companion told him to calm down and reminded him that Chung Myung was not foolish and would return before it became too late. Still, he hoped nothing had happened. Then sounds came from behind the door. It slowly opened. Chung Myung stepped inside. Gul immediately closed the door behind him while Jang asked whether everything had gone well. As Chung Myung put his clothes back on, He casually explained that they simply had a peaceful conversation and that he had even been given travel money. Adjusting his sleeve and belt, he realized that his identity had not been exposed and everything had gone smoothly. But for some reason, he felt disappointed. Looking down, Chung Myung thought that no matter how great the Plum Blossom Sword style once was, it was no longer the symbol of the sect. Even someone who had spent his whole life near the sect failed to recognize it after seeing the technique. His companion looked at him and asked why he had left the sect. Chung Myung smiled and said that children did not need to know such things. Gul pointed out that he was still a child himself, but Chung Myung dismissed it and told him to gather everyone because training would begin. His companion hesitated and asked whether training was really necessary today. Chung Myung told him to listen carefully. Clenching his fist, he declared that from this day onward, no training session should ever be missed. Rain, snow, wind, severe frost, or even the collapse of the sect would not become excuses to rest. Gul smiled and agreed to gather everyone, realizing how serious Chung Myung was. Then Chung Myung explained that he personally would not participate because he still had something else to do. Zhang pointed out that only the youngest disciple could lead the training. He added that if Chung Myung expected real results, then it would be better for him to supervise personally. Chung Myung agreed. As his companion left, he asked whether Chung Myung would really conduct the training later, and Chung Myung confirmed it. After everyone left, Chung Myung lay down on the bed and began thinking. Remembering the merchants, he realized that the former trustees had gradually taken control of every business. Then another memory returned. When the enemies invaded the sect, the fire had destroyed all of the accounting records, which had been the only proof of ownership. If those records had survived, none of this would have happened. For a moment, he imagined simply storming in and dealing with the merchants directly. But he quickly dismissed the idea. If he acted recklessly, everyone would only believe that the sect had pushed a child into committing crimes. What he needed was a solution that would free the sect from the debt completely. He needed proof that those businesses had belonged to the sect from the beginning. Closing his eyes, Chung Myung searched his memories. Then he remembered an elder secretly writing something down. Whenever Chung Myung approached, the elder would immediately hide a thin book. His eyes opened. That book. Chung Myung suddenly sat up. That could only mean one thing. The real ledger had been stored somewhere else. There were countless businesses under the sect's control, and no small notebook could contain records for all of them. He pictured an old corridor. Then the answer became clear. There had to be a hidden storage facility accessible only to the sect leader. Remembering the leader's residence, Chung Myung recalled old rumors mentioning such a place. It had to exist, and it was most likely somewhere near the leader's house. Holding his head, he realized the house still remained where it had always been. He imagined the surrounding area and concluded that the storage could not be obvious. The most likely location was the hill behind the house. A smile appeared on his face. If it had been built underground inside the hill, nobody would ever suspect it existed, unless they already knew. Chung Myung realized that an unexpected treasure hunt had begun. He immediately opened the window. Jumping outside, he mentally apologized to the great leader and hoped he would understand. At the same time, he reminded himself that reviving the sect came first. Landing on the wall with a stick resting across his shoulder, he decided that if he found the ledger, he would hand it directly to the leader. With a grin, he leaped down. A bright flash crossed the mountains. Later, sitting on the ground, Chung Myung muttered that he would not die from something like this. Standing in the forest, he realized that even a small hill was still a mountain, and searching it would not be easy. He looked down. Blue energy spread through his body. Something slowly began forming in his hands. Immediately afterward, Chung Myung placed both hands on the ground. A bright stream of energy spread beneath the surface as he reasoned that if the energy collided with a large empty space, it would reveal a hidden storage area. Looking across the mountain, he realized he had no idea where the storage actually was. Even so, there should not be a hollow space underground without reason. After exhausting himself and dropping to the ground, he concluded that this location was wrong, but he refused to stop. Another flash of energy spread through the mountains. Chung Myung decided to try again. Then suddenly, the energy reacted in one particular area. His eyes widened. The glow flowing from his hands disappeared. Grabbing his tool, he realized he had finally found it. Swinging the pickaxe, he understood that all that remained was uncovering the hidden storage. As he dug into the ground, he told himself that everything would work out if he could just see what was below. Soon, brick flooring appeared. Chung Myung stared in surprise. He wondered why the roof appeared to be ordinary stone when the sect's ledger and valuables were supposedly hidden there. He removed one brick. Then he looked inside. A corridor stretched into the darkness. At that moment, he realized he had discovered an entrance leading underground. Then suddenly, someone's foot appeared. Chung Myung froze. The sect leader was walking through the corridor. Watching him, Chung Myung realized that the leader had known about this place all along. The old man stopped. He slowly placed his hand against the wall ahead. Chung Myung noticed cracks across the surface and understood that this was the real entrance to the underground storage. The leader's hand trembled. At first, Chung Myung thought he was trying to do something, but then he realized the old man simply could not. He stood there silently in front of the wall. Thinking back to the sect's collapsing entrance, Chung Myung understood that its decline could no longer be hidden. As the sect weakened, ignorance spread and management alone could not reverse the situation. Looking at the old man, Chung Myung realized he had spent his entire life protecting the sect only to watch it slowly collapse. He wondered what the leader truly felt. The trembling hand gave him the answer. This was not someone who could share his burden. As the person meant to support everyone else, he had to carry everything alone. Here, in this hidden place, only his pain and regret remained. The sun slowly rose over the mountains. Light entered through a gap above. Chung Myung jumped down into the corridor. Standing in the middle of the long passage, he looked into the darkness and felt the weight of everything. Then he turned around. It was not too late. But before anything else, he had to open this door. Placing his hand against it, he released energy directly from his body. The energy flowed into the surface, then his eyes widened. The wall reflected it back. Looking carefully, Chung Myung realized what it was. Eternal iron. The door was made from it and was as thick as an arm. It was a metal more valuable than gold. Yet an entire underground chamber had been built with it. Keeping his hand on the surface, Chung Myung realized only the strongest martial artists could destroy such a barrier. Now he understood why the leader had never even attempted to force it open. Light continued to pour into the corridor. Then Chung Myung realized another problem. He could not cut through it either. Standing in front of the door, he understood that if the elder had entered before, there had to be another method. There had to be a key. His eyes widened. He reached toward the door and placed both hands against it. Only then did he notice strange markings. Touching them carefully, he realized they were not decorations. They were sword traces. His expression changed. These marks resembled the Plum Blossom Sword style. The patterns reminded him of the 24 Plum Blossom Sword. Looking more closely, he recognized techniques connected to the bamboo leaf form, one of the hidden principles of the Plum Blossom Sword. Another pattern followed. Everything slowly began connecting in his mind. Perhaps this itself was the key to opening the door. Exhaling slowly, Chung Myung realized the mechanism would require several stages. Imagining the sword forms, he understood that only by combining bamboo mastery, the 6 interactions, and the 24 Plum Blossom Sword could someone reveal the true power of the Plum Blossom Sword style and open the door. Looking at the center of the pattern, he realized he had figured out the activation method. But there was still a problem. Tilting his head, he understood that his current body could not handle it. If he still had his previous body, there would be no issue. The technique remained in his memory, and he knew how to reproduce it, but his current body was only that of an ordinary teenager. It simply lacked enough energy to execute every stage continuously. Holding his head, he admitted that he did not want to resort to this. But there was no other option. Placing a hand on his stomach, he accepted that recovery would take at least a month. Energy began gathering inside him. Soon, a purple aura emerged and illuminated the corridor. Chung Myung recognized it as the circulation of natural qi, the life force every person carries from birth. Using it meant paying a heavy price. But he had no alternative. His qi gradually turned bright pink. The same glow spread across his blade. Gritting his teeth, he reminded himself that he only needed to do this once. Wiping blood from his face, he forced himself to believe it would succeed despite still being unfamiliar with this reborn body. He stepped forward. Moving quickly, he realized there would not be a second attempt. He swung the sword. Blood spilled from his mouth. Holding the blade tightly, he realized everything was still too slow and that both his body and mind were already reaching their limit. He tightened his grip. Then he shifted backward and launched 4 rapid strikes, flowing from the 6 interactions into bamboo mastery. Without breaking the connection, he followed with 4 more attacks and transitioned into the 24 Plum Blossom Sword. His body spun as strike after strike connected. Bright streams of energy rushed into the patterns carved across the wall. Blood spilled from his mouth again. The markings gradually glowed pink. Drops of blood scattered across the floor. Wiping his mouth, Chung Myung stared ahead and wondered whether it had worked. If the door failed to open after this, everything would collapse. Then every groove in the wall filled with light. He remained seated in front of the door. Suddenly, a small crack appeared. Then a narrow opening formed. Chung Myung smiled. The door had opened. Blood flowed from his mouth once more and dripped onto the surface. Breathing heavily and dropping to one knee, he realized recovery would now take at least 2 more months. Reviving the sect was proving far more difficult than expected. After resting briefly, he slowly stood. Standing before the open entrance, he wiped the blood from his face and decided it was finally time to see what the elder had hidden so carefully. He pushed the door open. It continued opening until the entire room was revealed. Looking inside, he was surprised to find only 3 bookshelves. He had expected far more. Then he remembered, only the most valuable things deserved a storage room built entirely from eternal iron. He picked up one of the books. The elder had complained every day about having no money, yet had spent everything protecting this place. Turning the book in his hands, Chung Myung suddenly froze. Opening it, he realized he had found the sect's ledger. Along with the original stored in the finance pavilion, the elder had also preserved a copy here. Reaching for more books, Chung Myung realized that this would become the end of those merchants. His clothes quickly filled with books. Then he looked back at the shelves and wondered whether this place truly contained nothing except paper. Putting his hand to his side, Chung Myung thought it would have been convenient if the elder had hidden away some wealth as well. It would have helped with food, daily needs, and creating the foundation for reviving the sect. Picking up another book, he wondered what else the elder had prepared and turned toward the second cabinet. Opening it, he found records of unfamiliar secret techniques and questioned whether any of them were still practiced. Then his eyes widened. These are not current teachings. Standing before the shelf, he realized these were forgotten teachings, arts that had nearly disappeared from the sect. Remembering the elder, Chung Myung thought it must have been difficult for him to destroy techniques, even those that were never meant to reach future generations. Closing the book, he understood that the elder had hidden them here in case they might one day become necessary for the sect. Looking at the shelves, Chung Myung realized something. The first cabinet proved that the elder had fulfilled his responsibility as the leader of the sect. The second revealed his concerns and his affection for it. Holding the book, Chung Myung silently decided that the elder no longer needed to worry. He would restore the sect. Then he corrected himself. No, the sect would rise even higher than before. His attention shifted to the third cabinet. Unlike the others, it contained only a single package. He picked it up. Inside was a document personally signed by the sect leader. Opening it, Chung Myung read that if someone was reading this letter, then that person had already been recognized by the next generation's leader. The letter stated that sometimes a single line written on paper could carry more meaning than 100 spoken words. Standing in the center of the storage room, Chung Myung continued reading. The elder wrote that being the head of the sect did not mean controlling it with force, and that whoever inherited the position should already understand this. According to the letter, those who truly carried the sect forward were its students, the children who continued striving to improve. The leader's role was simply to guide them, protect them, and help them reach their potential. The elder wrote that the successor should not worry too much about controlling the sect, because the sect itself was not something that could be forced into shape. It was a spirit, an energy, something no one could truly command. The letter continued. Whether in decline or in prosperity, the sect would continue to exist. The ancestors protected its aspirations, raised successors, and passed their will forward. As the previous leader, he now passed that burden to the next generation. Chung Myung looked at the document for a moment. Then he folded it carefully and quietly dismissed the old man's habit of speaking at length. Standing in the room, he realized he had not found what he originally hoped for. Still, what he had found was enough. The important thing was the ledger. Turning away, Chung Myung knew that with it, he could recover the businesses that originally belonged to the sect. But as he started to leave, something suddenly bothered him. He stopped and looked around again. The structure of this storage felt strange. Remembering the previous leader, Chung Myung recalled how meticulous he had been. Even the oil lamps had always been placed symmetrically so the room would be lit evenly. His eyes moved back to the third cabinet. Unlike the others, it was almost empty. Chung Myung placed a hand on the shelf, then suddenly grabbed it with both hands. Lifting the cabinet away from the wall, he became certain there had to be something hidden. He set it aside. Behind it, there was a hole. Chung Myung looked into the opening. His eyes widened. He had discovered a hidden chamber. Looking inside, he immediately understood there had to be something important hidden there. He jumped down. Then he froze. Gold was stacked tightly in front of him. His eyes moved across neatly arranged weapons and valuable swords lined against the wall. Sitting on the floor, Chung Myung realized he had found an entire mountain of wealth along with secret techniques he had never seen before. Picking up jewelry in his hands, he laughed. His voice echoed as he realized he had suddenly become rich. Elsewhere, the leader stood by the window of his residence and quietly exhaled. Morning had arrived. He thought that this day would bring happiness to someone, but for him, it would only bring despair. Closing his eyes, he remembered that only 5 days remained before the deadline given by the owner of Kong Pavilion. Then someone urgently called his name. Opening the door, the leader asked what had happened. The assistant hurriedly explained that it would be easier to understand after seeing it in person. When asked where they were going, the assistant only insisted that it was urgent. The two immediately set off. They crossed through the forest. While moving, the leader suddenly noticed students collapsed on the ground. Jumping over them, he worried about what had happened. The assistant explained that the students had simply been training on their own since morning. Soon they arrived. Chung Myung was sitting there. When called, he looked over. The assistant quickly asked where he had been. Standing nearby, Chung Myung told them to come closer. The leader looked around in confusion and asked what had happened. Exhausted, Chung Myung pointed ahead and explained that something important had been found. The leader still cared more about the student's condition, but eventually looked where Chung Myung indicated. A bright light reflected across his face. In front of him lay bags of gold and countless valuables. Chung Myung casually explained that he had found them by accident. The old man turned in disbelief. Chung Myung simply claimed he may have overdone his training. Instead of questioning further, the leader told him to rest. Sweat slowly formed on the old man's face. But his attention was not on the gold. It was on the books. With trembling hands, he realized they were far more valuable than everything else. Reaching toward them, he recognized records connected to the enterprises of the Great Hashan domain in Hain. Then he suddenly pulled his hand back. He became careful. If he damaged the pages by opening them carelessly, he felt he would never forgive himself. Slowly, he reached again and opened the book. His eyes widened. The next moment, his head tilted back and he collapsed. The assistant rushed toward him. Later, waking up abruptly, the old man shouted about the 7 postulates of the wild plum sword. Back in the residence, he immediately asked about the contents of the box. The assistant confirmed everything. The leader then ordered the head of finance to be called. The finance elder arrived holding the records. Smiling, he explained that every document was original. The leader asked if that was truly confirmed. The answer was yes. Even the ownership rights had been verified. These were official government certificates that could serve as legal proof. The finance elder explained that they could immediately reclaim all of the sect's businesses, including Taiha Tower. Combined with the treasure, everything was more than enough to cover the debt of 100,000 yang. The old man lowered his head. For the first time in a long while, he was hearing only good news. Then he suddenly remembered Chung Myung. No one had expected that a single child, the one who insisted on changing everything, would become the person to pull the sect back up. The old man quietly clenched his fists. Rising from his chair, the leader realized that if the ledger was genuine, there was no time to waste. He immediately decided to summon the necessary people. Raising his hand, the sect leader gave the order that everyone connected to the enterprises recorded in the sect's Huan prefecture should be gathered at once. The records had finally resurfaced. Now it was time to bring in everyone whose names appeared in them. A few days later, the merchants climbed the mountain together. Someone behind complained about being pushed, and the owner turned around and told everyone there was not much farther to go and that they only needed a little more patience. As they continued upward, the advisor thought that once he received his money, he would forget this unpleasant place entirely. He already felt tired of even looking at it. One merchant asked why the leader had suddenly called them to the mountain, while another wondered whether he had truly prepared the money. Someone pointed out that 100,000 yang was not a small amount, and assumed the old man had called them only because he had nowhere else to get that kind of money. Remembering the entrance to the sect, the owner thought there was no point in begging once the final day arrived, and assumed the leader had gathered them beforehand for that reason. Ahead of them, some merchants quietly complained that calling them all here just to ask for more time was shameless. Others responded that regardless of debt, the old man was still the leader of a great sect and deserved some respect. Even so, everyone hoped they would not leave empty-handed. As they climbed higher, the advisor thought about the appearance of someone from the Southern Edge sect and concluded that others already had plans involving the sect's estate. He calculated that his own share would be around 5,000 yang, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life without returning to trade. Eventually, they reached the entrance. The owner raised his head and realized they all carried similar thoughts. The merchants breathed heavily. The leader understood that they all felt uneasy about the future of the sect because the place that had protected Huam for centuries now stood on the edge of collapse. The advisor also realized that if no concessions were made today, the sect might not survive another 7 days. Still, they had climbed the mountain intending to collect the debt that had continued growing over time. A faint smile appeared. Then someone approached. The assistant bowed and greeted them before informing everyone that the leader was already waiting. The merchants gathered in front of the residence. The leader stood there with his hands behind his back and welcomed them. He acknowledged the difficulty of climbing such a dangerous path. The visitors replied that they all had responsibilities, though the leader surely carried even more. Hai and Jiang offered them tea and suggested they rest after the climb. Everyone remained standing. One of them politely declined and explained that resolving urgent matters was more important than comfort. The old man remained silent for a moment. Then he admitted that he had acted selfishly. The owner narrowed his eyes as Hai and Jiang explained that he had gathered everyone to discuss the sect's position. The old man said he had spent a long time searching for every possible way to repay them. But despite all efforts, he could not repay everything on time. The owner listened quietly. The owner reminded him that enough time had already been given and everyone also depended on that money to live. The deadline could not continue moving. After a pause, Hai and Jiang admitted that he could not repay everything, but he could repay part of it. Holding his hands together, he asked whether anyone present would be willing to wait a little longer. Then he lowered himself and asked them to help the sect. The merchant stayed silent. The advisor's eyes widened. The leader remained bowed. From behind, Chung Myung watched everything. Resting his head on one hand, he realized this was probably the decision the old man had reached. But he still did not fully understand the intention. Was this an attempt to pressure them, or was it mercy? As he continued watching, Chung Myung became certain of one thing. Hai and Jiang was far more calculating than he appeared. The entrance to the sect's territory came into view as Chung Myung reflected that secrecy was an essential quality for someone leading an entire sect. His eyes moved across the weapon racks, and he realized that even though disciples still lived here, the current state of the sect had become little more than a fading name. Lying on the roof, Chung Myung understood why the leader had to accept both profit and loss without losing control. Looking down, he tried to understand whether the old man was feeling anger. The owner smiled and reminded everyone that they had already agreed there could be no more delays because extending the deadline previously had already caused problems. Then his expression changed. The old man explained that this request was not directed only at the owner. Narrowing his eyes, the leader stated that the sect's debt totaled 100,000 yang and that everyone present was owed a different amount. He calmly explained that he was asking only those willing to delay repayment. The merchants looked at each other in surprise. The owner frowned and considered it a desperate attempt. Someone asked whether those unwilling to make concessions would still receive immediate repayment. Standing before them, the old man admitted that the sect was no longer what it had once been. But that did not mean nobody would extend a helping hand. Although he had failed to gather the full 100,000, part of the amount had already been prepared. That was exactly why he asked for understanding and promised that anyone who supported the sect today would be repaid. The owner questioned the logic behind those words. Another advisor asked whether gratitude alone would be enough if they postponed repayment. The old man confirmed it. Then the advisor raised his hand and asked for complete honesty. Everyone knew the sect could collapse tomorrow. The crowd began discussing among themselves. Some wondered whether postponing payment meant losing everything. Others questioned what reason they had to trust the sect at all. The old man exhaled. Then he opened his eyes. He asked whether the name and history of the sect truly meant nothing to them. The owner suddenly smiled. Then he laughed. Chung Myung continued watching from above. The owner kept laughing and questioned whether the old man was pressuring them. The leader calmly asked whether this truly counted as pressure. Then he asked a question in return. What did the sect mean to them? Did the name and history of this place truly have no value? Images of the past seemed to overlap with the present. The old man admitted that the sect was currently in decline. But for generations, the sect had remained inseparably connected to Huam and had shared its spirit and strength with the people there. He asked everyone standing before him to think again about what this place had meant to them. The owner closed his eyes. Then he made a proposal. Pointing to one side, he suggested that anyone willing to postpone repayment should move there. Those who wanted immediate payment should remain where they stood. He added that responsibility for the decision would belong entirely to them. No one should expect the trade alliance to rescue them if they later lost their money. The time to choose had come. The merchants looked away. No one moved. A smile appeared on the owner's face as he spread his arms and declared that nobody intended to delay repayment. Then, someone stepped forward. One advisor quietly separated from the group. The owner immediately called out to him. The leader silently watched. The owner asked what he thought he was doing. The advisor calmly replied that there was no need to react like that because he already knew people would see it as betrayal. Then he looked directly at the owner and quietly remarked that the owner was not originally from Huam after all. The man looked down and explained that he had come to this place as a son-in-law, so he could never fully understand what the sect meant to people born here. A memory surfaced. As a child, he had once stood with his father, who pointed toward the mountain and spoke about the sect. Everyone used to say that anyone accepted there could become a great master. The child kept staring at the mountain. Years passed. Even after learning that he lacked the talent to enter, he still grew up surrounded by stories about that place. Stories of how the sect protected the land and watched over Huam. The owner narrowed his eyes and questioned why he suddenly brought this up. The advisor lowered his head and explained that his father and grandfather had grown up the same way. To them, this place had always been a source of pride. Looking at the others, he said that once they received the money, most of them would simply leave and use it elsewhere. But he had spent his entire life on these lands. The owner asked whether that alone was enough reason to reject such a large amount of money. The advisor looked at him. The owner warned that he would regret it. Sweat appeared on the advisor's face as he remembered climbing the mountain, thinking only about money and the comfortable life that would follow. Clenching his fist, he realized his decision made no practical sense. But he also knew he could still survive without that money. Even if he regretted missing the opportunity later, he could live with that. But if he helped tear the sect apart piece by piece, he would regret it until the end of his life while surrounded by meaningless wealth. Looking at the others, he admitted that he did not want such a life. The owner raised his hand and said it would not matter because one person alone would change nothing. Then suddenly someone spoke. People began asking why the advisor was standing there alone. More merchants started crossing to the opposite side. Soon 4 more people stood behind him. The leader's eyes widened. He looked at them quietly. Then he lowered his head. Looking at them, he admitted that he was glad there were still people who respected the sect. The advisor turned as the leader instructed the assistant to bring something. Unam placed a box on the ground. Inside were books. The owner immediately recognized them. It was the ledger of Huam County. The leader looked at him and reminded everyone that since ancient times, the sect had treated them with kindness. Yet they had repaid that trust with betrayal. Sweat formed on the owner's face. Then the leader stepped forward and declared that based on these records, the sect would reclaim every business they had managed. Everything gained through those businesses would also be confiscated. The merchants immediately protested and demanded an explanation. The old man calmly replied that he meant exactly what he had said. Holding the ledger, the owner said the joke had gone too far. The leader answered that it was unfortunate that the leader of such a respected sect appeared to be a joke in his eyes. The owner shut the book and asked him to wait. Holding the records, he argued that nobody could know for certain whether they were genuine. The old man stood with his hands behind his back. The owner suggested that perhaps the leader himself had been deceived by a forged ledger. The leader looked at him in silence. Then he closed his eyes and admitted that there might be some reason in verifying such a claim. A house roof came into view as he instructed the assistant to call the head of the finance pavilion. Henan stroked his beard. After examining the matter, the finance director stated that confirming the ledger's authenticity would require a proper investigation. The merchants immediately raised their voices and demanded verification. Then the finance director turned around and calmly spoke. With a faint smile, Henan explained that he had expected such doubts and had already sent half of the ledger to the Huam government 2 days earlier for authentication. The owner froze. Thinking back to the city, he immediately understood the situation. If officials had already begun investigating the enterprises while all the merchants remained gathered at the sect, there would be no chance to resist. The real goal had been to draw them away from the city. His expression stiffened. Looking at the records, he realized 2 days was more than enough to complete the inspection. Clenching his fists, he understood that the documents in the box had already been verified. Grinding his teeth, he realized government forces were probably already waiting at the foot of the mountain to seize everything. Then someone called out. The old man stepped forward and ordered them to control themselves because they no longer had the right to protest. Standing with his hands behind his back, Hai and Jiang said they had rejected the hand of an old friend in hardship. Not only that, they had betrayed that friend. Because of that, they no longer deserved to call themselves allies. Looking at them, he told them to return. Everything would become clear once they reached Huam. Grinding his teeth, the owner listened as Hai and Jiang explained that his original intention had been to confiscate everything. But considering their years of effort, they would still be allowed to keep 1 cart of goods. The owner frowned and quietly declared that he would not forget this debt. Then he turned around and began leaving. The merchants silently followed. One advisor turned back and listened as Hai and Jiang added that at least they had not completely abandoned their humanity. The old man continued and explained that the enterprises would still return to the sect. That part would not change, but the sect would also restore everything it had lost. Closing his eyes, Hai and Jiang announced that those willing could continue managing the businesses locally and continue earning profits. He invited them to discuss future cooperation and asked them to come inside. Looking down, the advisor realized this arrangement was far better than remaining dependent on the owner. In an instant, their positions had changed. The former owner had become the weaker side. The man closed his eyes. Meanwhile, the merchants continued down the mountain. Hearing the sect leader, Chung Myung, cursed at him. He shouted, asking who allowed him to throw away property that belonged to the sect. The carts continued moving. As they traveled, one merchant remembered that when they had descended, government troops had already occupied the businesses and treated them coldly. If not for the leader's instructions, they would likely have been detained immediately. Looking toward the owner, the merchant realized none of this would have happened if they had not followed him. Someone asked what they should do now. The owner stayed silent while another merchant continued blaming him for everything. The owner narrowed his eyes and asked whether he was being accused. The man immediately denied it. The owner set the handles down and raised his hand. He told everyone to stop speaking carelessly. For now, they simply needed shelter and time. Then he asked whether anyone truly believed the ledger was genuine. He insisted it was fake and claimed the leader had deceived them with forged records. Another merchant disagreed. He pointed out that the government had already confirmed the documents and admitted he had secretly checked their contents himself. The records were real. Spreading his arms, the former owner argued that everyone had conspired together with the leader to divide the property. Frowning, he declared that they needed to head to Loyang. Clenching his fist, he insisted that if those people intended to pressure them through authority, then they only needed to find a way to fight back. Suddenly, someone appeared in front of the group and dismissed everything they had just said. It was Chung Myung. The owner looked at him and asked whether he had spoken. Chung Myung casually asked whether there was anyone else standing there. Squinting, the owner wondered why someone was dressed like a robber in broad daylight and assumed he was dealing with some strange old-fashioned person. Waving his hand, the owner warned him to leave if he valued his life and suggested he had come for their property. Chung Myung immediately corrected him. He had not come to rob anyone. He had come to take back what rightfully belonged to him. The owner narrowed his eyes and tried to understand what he meant. Then he asked whether Chung Myung belonged to the sect. Before the conversation continued, someone was suddenly thrown over the carts. The owner had barely finished talking about teaching someone from the sect a lesson. Bodyguards immediately appeared. Several rushed toward Chung Myung with serious expressions. They attacked all at once. Chung Myung looked up. Then he moved. In an instant, he appeared in front of one of them. He struck with the hilt of his sword. Another took a hit to the jaw. A third was struck in the back of the head. Chung Myung moved through them with overwhelming speed. Lowering the blade, he remarked that apparently they still did not understand. He calmly explained that people who ignored his warnings rarely walked away comfortably. The owner narrowed his eyes and realized there were still skilled people left in the sect. As several guards struggled back to their feet, the owner told them to step aside. Facing Chung Myung directly, he admitted that someone with this level of ability should not have hidden inside the mountain. If a disciple like him had stood at the front earlier, the sect would never have fallen this far. Then his expression changed. The owner said Chung Myung had chosen a very unfortunate moment. Energy gathered around him. He declared that killing this disciple would become a message to the leader. Aura spread around his body as he assumed the old man would be devastated by such a loss. Then he attacked. Watching him, Chung Myung realized this man was far from an ordinary merchant. He drew the sheathed sword and calmly decided not to give him an easy exchange. The owner had already closed the distance. An explosion echoed through the forest. The owner landed with both hands pressed to the ground. For a moment, nothing moved. Looking forward, the owner reminded himself that even a tiger used full strength to catch a rabbit. The masked figure moved closer. Chung Myung stopped. Looking at the owner, he thought the man looked ready to fall asleep. Throwing the weapon over his shoulder, Chung Myung decided to erase that expression immediately. He rushed forward. The owner was surprised. A second later, they stood only a step apart. The owner struck with his fist. Energy exploded through the attack. But something unexpected happened. The force rebounded. Watching closely, Chung Myung understood exactly what happened. He had intercepted the attack and redirected the energy back. Resting the weapon on his shoulder again, he advised the owner to stop. His movements had already slowed noticeably. The owner became irritated after hearing that another few exchanges would destroy his fingers. Energy gathered into his leg. He twisted and attacked again. Another impact exploded. When it ended, Chung Myung was already behind him. He touched the weapon once more. Energy surged again. Looking at the owner, Chung Myung repeated that the fingers would fail first. The dark-haired man dropped to one knee. Looking at the swollen veins on his hand, the owner finally realized something. This masked opponent was not especially stronger or faster. Yet he fought as though he could defeat 10 people. The owner attacked again, but nothing worked. Even though Chung Myung appeared relaxed, he always chose the perfect timing, the correct angle, and the exact distance. Grinning slightly, the owner realized there was not a single wasted movement in his opponent's technique. Chung Myung leaned back and avoided the strike. The owner immediately stepped forward again. Watching the masked opponent, he realized he could not even estimate how strong this person really was. Standing a short distance away, Chung Myung quietly admitted that this pace would not work. Scratching his neck, he added that he had wanted to enjoy the fight a little longer, but his strength was already fading. The owner asked how someone with this level of skill had remained unknown for so long. For a few moments, both remained silent. Then the weapons lowered. Resting the sword over his shoulder, Chung Myung casually asked what would really change if his identity became known. Closing his eyes, he listened as the owner implied that people who talk too much often lived in illusions. Chung Myung stepped forward. Instead of answering, he turned the question back. Someone with this level of combat skill was clearly not an ordinary pavilion owner. There were countless ways for a master like this to earn wealth, so why settle for managing a pavilion? The owner raised his hand and tried to end the discussion. Chung Myung continued calmly. He concluded that this was neither a conspiracy nor someone else's orders. Everything seemed to be personal initiative. The owner silently admitted that the conclusion was correct. Chung Myung raised one finger and said there was one final question. How is someone supposed to get information from a person like this? Then he answered it himself, by beating it out of him. The owner was surprised. Holding the weapon loosely, Chung Myung explained that there was no point wasting words on someone who had already decided not to answer. Then he rushed forward. He declared that he would simply continue until he was satisfied. Watching him approach, the owner noticed something strange. The attack appeared, aimed at his right knee. Standing still, he wondered how anyone could react at that speed. Chung Myung swung. Pain exploded, but the strike landed on the shoulder instead. The owner did not understand. He had seen the attack with his own eyes. Chung Myung immediately moved again. The owner raised his hand and became certain the next strike would target his head. The weapon flashed in front of his face. Chung Myung closed the distance instantly. The pressure became even heavier. Then, the owner suddenly found his throat seized. Frowning, he realized something terrifying. He had watched every movement, yet he had never successfully dodged. Several energy-charged strikes swept across his body. Throwing his head back, he realized that if this continued, he would actually die. Chung Myung quietly observed his expression. His eyes slowly turned red. Then, he drew the sword from its sheath. Fear immediately spread across the owner's face. Bending from pain, he realized he did not want to die. Chung Myung stepped forward. The blade moved. Out of instinct, the owner threw up his hand. Blue energy exploded through the forest. Smoke rose above the trees. The owner extended his hand and tried gathering energy again. Then he froze. Chung Myung asked about the palm of the Lord of Tai. Squatting down in front of him, Chung Myung stared directly into his face. Then he asked whether he belonged to the Southern Edge sect. Still crouched, he remarked that it was surprising to see a pavilion owner collecting debts from the sect while using such advanced techniques. He raised his hand again and asked directly, had the Southern Edge sect sent him? Fear crossed the owner's face. At that moment, he realized he should have stayed silent, even if it meant enduring everything. Biting his lip, he understood that he had made a fatal mistake. Remembering the last exchange, Chung Myung realized that if he had not caught the opponent off guard, the man would not have exposed himself by using the palm of the Lord of Tai. If everything had truly been planned from the beginning, then the enemy's foresight was impressive. Watching him silently, Chung Myung asked whether he intended to remain quiet. The man slowly stood. Chung Myung decided that this outcome was not bad either. Loyalty had value. Thinking quietly, he remembered that hostility had existed between the Southern Edge sect and the sect for a long time, which was why their relationship had never improved. Even so, he could not deny that the Southern Edge sect deserved its place among the 10 great sections. Rubbing his neck, Chung Myung thought that a powerful sect should never solve problems in such a low and indirect way. Looking at the opponent, he concluded there was little more to learn from him. Knowing the matter connected back to Shongan was already enough. With a faint grin, Chung Myung cursed whoever stood behind this. Holding his sword, he remarked that although the old martial world had never been perfect, it had not acted this shamelessly. He wondered whether the great sects had started competing over wealth instead of principles. The dark-haired man closed his eyes. Then he asked whether this was truly the best future for the sect. Frowning, he declared that the sect had already lost hope. Without its secret techniques and former masters, it could never return to what it once was. At best, it would only delay collapse. Chung Myung looked surprised. The man continued insisting that a sect without masters could only disappear. Raising his hand, he asked whether Chung Myung truly could not see it. Chung Myung rested the sword on his shoulder and calmly asked, who said the sect had lost its techniques? Swinging the blade once, he mocked the logic of people who talked too much. If they wanted to destroy the sect, they should simply admit it instead of hiding behind excuses. As the opponent watched, he realized something. The two sects shared similarities. Even their sword styles felt connected. Two blades crossed through the air. The man fell face first. A memory surfaced in Chung Myung's mind. When two great sects with similar paths stood too close to one another, one would eventually struggle. The treetops swayed. The owner shouted that he was not from the Southern Edge sect and demanded to know what nonsense this was. Then his eyes widened. Chung Myung placed the sword near his face and said that, in return for revealing that technique, he would show him something interesting. The owner slowly raised his head. Fear appeared on his face. Chung Myung remarked that it would be amusing if the people behind him learned about this, but unfortunate if they never did. Looking directly into his eyes, he told him to report everything exactly as he saw it. Chung Myung lowered his eyes toward the blade. The owner's expression twisted. Then, the image of the sword multiplied. The owner raised both hands to defend himself. Lowering his head, He wondered how someone could create such overwhelming pressure from simple sword movements. But despite the countless blades, none touched him. Confused, he could not understand what Chung Myung was trying to do. Then he heard the words, "When plum blossoms bloom in winter, their fragrance becomes strongest." Chung Myung swung again. Winter may have arrived, but the sect's season had not ended. He turned his back and took several steps away. The owner remained frozen in defense. Then he slowly looked up. His hands lowered. His eyes widened. Chung Myung still stood there holding the sword. Around him, petals drifted downward. Chung Myung quietly said that soon, plum blossoms would cover the entire mountain. The owner raised his head. Thousands of falling plum blossoms seemed to fill the sky. His expression froze. Then he realized there had been no attack. It was only an illusion. Slowly, the owner dropped to his knees. Chung Myung returned the sword to its sheath. Then he collapsed. Blood spilled from his mouth. Adjusting the mask on his face, he realized that continuing like this would eventually kill him because his current strength was still far from enough. Closing his eyes, he remembered that in his previous life, something like this would have been insignificant. Now, a single display of swordsmanship drained everything he had. Turning his head, he noticed someone hiding behind a tree. The person cautiously peeked out. Chung Myung raised a hand and called him over. Soon 4 men stood in front of him. Crossing his arms, Chung Myung casually asked who needed to be beaten before he left. All 4 immediately looked away. Watching them, he questioned who planned to leave like that. At once, they all insisted they had no intention of leaving. The dark-haired man closed his eyes. Even those who had already started moving froze in place. Then Chung Myung stopped everyone. One of the men turned slightly and looked uneasy. Looking at the carts, Chung Myung asked whether they seriously expected him to move everything alone. Then he ordered them to report how much each cart's contents were worth. One by one, they listed the values in Niang. Someone nervously asked whether that really mattered. Chung Myung opened his eyes. Then he calmly explained that one of them would go to the nearest bank and return with the money. And if anyone tried tricks with receipts, he would deal with them personally. One man realized he had never met someone like this before. Another raised his hand and asked what would happen if the person sent to the bank simply ran away. Smiling, Chung Myung asked what exactly they thought remained for them besides the confiscated property. He quietly suggested that recovering at least part of it would be wiser than losing everything. Another person raised a hand and asked what would happen if someone reported him to the government. Chung Myung demonstrated his technique. The sudden pressure startled the birds into flight. The man immediately became frightened. Lowering his head, Chung Myung calmly explained that if someone planned to do that, it would be better never to return and instead run to the edge of the continent. All 4 silently concluded that escaping was not worth considering. Then the order was given to move. Later, the smell of banknotes filled the air. A dark-haired man held stacks of bills. Chung Myung immediately ran toward the brick building. In the next moment, he jumped higher than the roof. Elsewhere, near the river, stones lined the water. Chung Myung removed his clothes. Nearby, Gul wrung water from his cloak. Water dripped to the ground. He turned and looked at the others. Everyone looked exhausted after the long training. Still, they smiled. They all realized they had changed. The disciples washed their clothes while Gul quietly thought that they had finally become true disciples of the sect. Then Zhang approached and asked why he looked so happy. Gul turned away and looked at everyone else. He admitted that now they truly felt like disciples. Looking down, he thought it was a strange feeling. Zhang disagreed at first, but eventually smiled and admitted he felt the same. Gul closed his eyes and laughed. He never expected training to become this intense. Soon the disciples rushed back toward the mountain. They would descend again to complete their daily quota before climbing back up. But recently, something had changed. The wind moved through their hair. Gul ran ahead with a faint smile. He quietly decided that Chung Myung was responsible for all of it. The mountains stretched into the distance. No one knew whether Chung Myung would remain an ordinary disciple or overturn the entire existence of the sect. The disciples continued running. Soon they reached the buildings. Workers carried wood and supplies while shouting instructions. Others hauled sacks across the grounds. The disciples entered the area. A Taoist raised his hand and directed where all the materials should be taken. Suddenly, the junior mentor turned around after Zhang called out. The disciples approached and asked what was happening. Unam turned and explained that the people around them were laborers. Looking across the area, He added that they had decided to use the opportunity to carry out major renovations. Ghoul stood beside his companion as the junior mentor explained that the buildings had fallen into serious disrepair. The worn roofs came into view. The disciples stared in surprise. Unam asked why they were standing around and told them to help the exhausted workers. Ghoul froze briefly while Jang immediately accepted the order. The mentor pointed ahead and the boys hurried off. Later, the building was brightly lit. A roasted chicken sat on the table. The students stared at the food in disbelief. Some nearly started drooling. One disciple became so excited he treated it like a gift from heaven. Soon everyone gathered around the table in excitement. Perhaps the changes brought by Chung Myung would arrive much sooner than expected. That night, under the moonlight, one disciple held a folded uniform and commented that the renovations had started too suddenly. Ghoul and Jang walked together and talked about how there had even been meat at dinner and everyone had received 2 new sets of clothes. The students still seemed unable to believe it. Ghoul asked what his companion was thinking. As they approached the gate, Jang laughed and admitted that having money felt surprisingly good. He had expected improvements, but not this quickly. Construction materials covered the grounds. Jang wondered whether the elders had truly endured hardship willingly all this time. Remembering one elder's smile, he realized he had never seen that expression before. The night sky stretched above them. Ghoul asked what would happen next. Approaching another building, the Taoist explained that the sect was changing rapidly and they should prepare themselves. Adjusting the uniform in his hands, he pointed out that not every change would necessarily be easy. Remembering the hidden documents, he reflected on everything that had happened. Ghoul walked ahead and wondered why Chung Myung had done all of this. The answer seemed obvious. He wanted everyone to see the change. The students smiled. The sect was clearly changing. Since change could not be avoided, they needed determination to keep up. Imagining Chung Myung standing in the middle of the wind, the Taoist thought that anyone acting carelessly could easily be swept away by the storm this boy had created. They opened the doors. Ghoul smiled and told his senior not to worry. Then he asked seriously where Chung Myung had gone since early morning. His companion guessed that he was probably in the leader's residence. Near the mountains stood a small building. Several people sat around a table. Hai and Jang explained that someone who had achieved such a result naturally deserved a reward. Smiling, he added that the sect had prepared one, and that was why Chung Myung had been called there. Chung Myung looked away. The old man asked whether there was something he wanted. For a moment, thoughts of treasure appeared. The leader even suggested that if Chung Myung regretted giving up the wealth they found, some compensation could be arranged. But Chung Myung refused. He said he had no interest in riches. The old man looked surprised and felt pleased, thinking the boy was following the path of Taoism, even though overcoming greed was never easy. Chung Myung quietly thought that his own storage was already full of treasures anyway. The teapot sat between them. The leader then offered to let him access the sect's secret techniques earlier than normal. Once again, Chung Myung refused. The old man widened his eyes and wondered whether the boy considered the sect's techniques unimportant. Chung Myung calmly replied that there was no reason to break the order established by the elders. Internally, though, he knew that was not the truth. If anything, he felt more qualified to teach than to learn. Thinking about the books and everything preserved in storage, he realized there was still much to teach the Taoists. The difficult part would be doing it without anyone noticing. Resting his head on one hand, Chung Myung decided not to worry about it yet. The room remained brightly lit. Looking quietly ahead, he thought they could even hand him the sect itself, because right now, all that remained was its name. The sect leader smiled as Chung Myung looked like he had finally made up his mind. Placing a hand on his chest, Chung Myung asked Henan to allow him to go down to Huam whenever necessary. He believed that broader movement would create more opportunities. Looking at the sect leader, he explained that constant training in a confined place limited his growth, and that moving freely would help him discover new limits and improve faster. The sect leader crossed his arms. Henan understood Chung Myung's intention, but explained that such freedom went against the sect's discipline. Chung Myung looked away. The sect leader added that although he had achieved something worthy, granting special treatment could create dissatisfaction among the other disciples. They remained seated. Hai and Jang asked whether there was anything else. Chung Myung thought that if they would not even let him travel freely, there was not much else to request. Then he touched his hair and leaned forward. He explained that his body was currently in terrible condition. Smiling slightly, he mentioned that the physician said his natural qi circulation had been damaged. The sect leader nodded and said he already knew. Placing a hand on his chest, Chung Myung asked whether he could receive some healing pills to restore his body. They sat facing each other. Then Henan called the attendants. Chung Myung's face immediately brightened. The sect leader calmly drank from his cup. After setting it down, he officially granted Chung Myung permission to go down a huam. The people nearby nodded. Chung Myung looked at the sect leader in surprise. Then the sect leader stood up and explained that permission did not mean unrestricted freedom. He pushed Chung Myung outside and reminded him that he would still be responsible for any trouble he caused. The doors closed. Chung Myung stared at them in disbelief. Annoyed, he thought that he had asked politely. Imagining the sect leader's face, he concluded that no medicine in the world would be enough for him. Inside the room, the sect leader placed a hand near the door and turned to his subordinates. He asked what they thought. One of them replied that Chung Myung seemed unusually suited to the path of Taoism. Sitting again, Hunan added that despite his age, the boy's words sounded surprisingly thoughtful. Remembering Chung Myung's expression, he admitted that although the boy could be rude, his age should still be considered. Looking down, Hunan reflected that speaking with Chung Myung never felt like speaking to a child. He imagined the boy surrounded by light and realized that he lacked the childish qualities expected at his age. Hunan quietly concluded that Chung Myung carried the presence of a true Taoist. The sect leader turned to Haiyaneng and asked for his opinion. The man touched his head and admitted that he was not good at judging people. After thinking for a while, another elder said that Chung Myung simply did not behave like a child. Wu Dam quietly agreed. Haiyan extended his hand and explained that intelligent children, or children who had experienced hardship, often became more mature than their peers. But Chung Myung felt different. His speech and behavior resembled those of a grown man. Someone cautiously asked whether there was something unnatural about him. The Taoist denied that interpretation. The sect leader closed his eyes. He said he understood their concerns, but decided not to attach too much meaning to them for now. After all, Chung Myung was still a child. Looking forward, the sect leader concluded that their role was not to use people, but to guide them. If Chung Myung truly was an unpolished diamond, then the sect would help him reach his full potential. The Taoist nodded. Then Henan turned to Unam and asked about the renovation work. Unam imagined the workers cutting wood and explained that bringing materials into the steep mountains remained difficult. Workers continued processing timber. To make up for shortages, they planned to use nearby forest resources, but the process would still take time. The sect leader stroked his beard. Unam became nervous when asked whether he was focusing too much on appearances. He immediately denied it. Looking away, the sect leader explained that the sect itself needed to be reborn. Half-finished tiles covered the roofs. He added that people expressed determination through their clothing and actions, and the same principle applied to the sect. Unam bowed and agreed that the sect leader's thinking was correct. Haiyang turned to Hyansen and said that the new teachings needed to be explained to the disciples as quickly as possible. Presenting the books, he emphasized that there could be no carelessness because the future of the sect depended on how well the students mastered these techniques. The Taoist respectfully accepted the responsibility and promised not to overlook anything. Standing near the doorway, Henyong said he could only trust his subordinates. The Taoist closed his eyes. As he examined the books, he noticed something strange. For teachings that were supposedly over 100 years old, they looked unusually new. Opening one of them, he realized that some sections even showed traces of fresh ink, as though someone had copied parts of them in a hurry. He shook his head and dismissed the thought. The contents still matched the originals. Looking down, he quietly wondered whether someone had been helping the sect while keeping their identity hidden. Meanwhile, Chung Myung walked into the forest, complaining to himself that the sect leader refused to give him the pills. Sitting on the ground, he grumbled that he had even copied the teachings for them. Writing on paper, he joked to himself that not even a beggar would willingly come to this place. Imagining the sect leader's face, he realized that not only had they lost their money, they had also lost the recipes for many elixirs. Standing up, he admitted that everything had become one giant problem. Purple energy flickered around him. He already knew the consequences would be serious. Touching his forehead, he realized the situation had turned out worse than expected. Standing in the open field, he concluded that if things continued this way, he might freeze and die within 6 months because his body was not recovering. Thinking about the growth of a child's body, he realized that stopping training for half a year would be extremely dangerous. His chi continued flowing through him. This period was the best time to build internal energy. If he missed it, there would not be another chance. Frowning, Chung Myung decided he needed another solution. He remembered 2 methods. One was medicinal pills that restored natural chi circulation. The other was receiving energy from another practitioner. Then another memory surfaced. In the past, there had been countless pills. He remembered casually taking them after drinking and recovering without effort. Looking down, he wondered whether he should do something similar now. Suddenly, his eyes widened. Sweat covered his face. It felt like he had remembered something important. Without hesitation, he started running. He crossed through the forest. Under the dark sky, he thought that even a troublesome mind could occasionally become useful. The moon illuminated the mountain. Then he stopped. Ahead stood an enormous obstacle, Dwanch Cliff, the highest and most dangerous place on a mountain. Halfway along the cliff was the location he had been searching for. A hidden cave. Chung Myung realized that in all of the sect, only he knew this place existed. Crossing his arms, he remembered that training near the cliff had always been forbidden. But because of that, there was no better place to hide from the sect leader's attention. His face reddened as he remembered hiding meat there and sleeping while avoiding the elders. Standing silently, he wondered how they had never killed him for it. But none of that mattered now. Looking at the cliff, he decided to climb. Then he stopped. In the past, reaching the cave would have taken 2 jumps. With his current body, that was impossible. Instead, he ran in the opposite direction. Soon he returned carrying a rope. Dragging it behind him, he reached the cliff again. Standing at the edge, he realized going down might actually be more dangerous. Looking into the abyss, he thought it was 10 times worse than climbing. Clenching his fist, he reminded himself that he had already died once. Then he immediately admitted he really did not want to die again. He tied the rope around a tree. Holding onto the cliff, he complained that reviving the sect was far too difficult. As he lowered himself, he remembered that training there had never been prohibited only because of the height. Stepping carefully onto a rock, he remembered why Dwanch Cliff had that name. It truly was a steep cliff. He continued descending. There was almost nothing to hold on to. Then his foot slipped. Chung Myung started falling. His eyes widened. The cliff was unbelievably smooth. He screamed. He screamed. A bright flash appeared above. And in that moment, he became certain he was going to die. Suddenly, the rope tightened, and Chung Myung was pulled upward. Suspended in the air, he reminded himself that preparation was the most important thing. As he neared the cliff, blue energy spread through his hands. He pressed both palms into the rock. His bones cracked. Holding on with one arm, he let out a strained breath. Grinding his teeth, he realized his bones felt as fragile as reeds. Sweat covered him. Looking sideways, he finally spotted the entrance to his hideout. Chung Myung narrowed his eyes. He only needed to reach it. He kicked off the cliff. The rope tightened again. Using the momentum, he jumped sideways and grabbed hold. Then he surged forward, but suddenly the rope snapped. His eyes widened. He fell. Activating his chi instantly, he reached for the cliff. His fingers cracked under the pressure. He slipped again. Then he crashed downward. Pain shot through his body. The broken rope continued falling until it suddenly caught. Chung Myung stopped. Now he hung directly beside the cave entrance. Below him stretched a bottomless abyss. Grabbing the edge, he slowly pulled himself up. Breathing heavily, he cursed the madness of the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. Fog drifted around the cliff. He stepped into the cave and reminded himself that he had only trained here in his previous life. Sweat dripped from his face. This had once been his hidden shelter. Covered by cloth inside the cave was something important. Although he had nearly died reaching it, he pulled the cloth away. Dust filled the air. Inside stood a simple mattress and table. Even the small glowing light remained. Its soft glow illuminated the cave. Nearby sat a chest. Chung Myung opened it. Inside was another box. His eyes lit up. He remembered hiding something here. Inside, the plum blossom pills. The medicine he had saved for healing. Bright pink light shone from the box. A sharp wind passed through the cave. Chung Myung frowned. Suddenly the air filled with the scent of plum blossoms. Several glowing pills rested inside. Holding them, he smiled widely. For a moment, he imagined the unhappy face of the sect leader and realized that the truly valuable ones had survived after all. He sat on the mattress. First, he needed to recover completely. His fingers trembled as he picked up a pill. Then he swallowed it and closed his eyes. The medicine moved deep into his body. Its shell dissolved. Light spread inside him. He remained seated while the energy began restoring his body. Pressing his lips together, he focused. He could not allow himself to lose concentration. Pink energy flowed around him. Grinding his teeth, Chung Myung realized he could not allow the snow plum pill's effects to escape. He clenched his fist tightly and tried to hold the energy in place. Pink light continued shining. Closing his eyes, he realized this alone would not restore his natural chi. Two streams of energy appeared in his mind. No matter how famous the snow plum pills were, their energy contained too many impurities. He would need to filter them. He concentrated and began separating the energy. The pill glowed brighter. He reminded himself that building the perfect foundation required patience. The choice was difficult, but rushing would only ruin everything. Imagining countless crystals, he decided to preserve only the purest energy. Everything else would be discarded. Eventually, only a tiny fragment remained. The crystal shone intensely. Using all his strength, he guided it. The energy entered his dantian. The sphere inside was covered in cracks. Chung Myung carefully directed the refined energy toward the deepest point, the core of his natural chi. The crystal approached. Then, it entered the crack. A brilliant flash erupted. The chi core shone intensely. Wind burst from the cave. A blue spark appeared. Lightning-like energy spread through the shelter. The floating light dropped to the floor. Chung Myung slowly rose into the air. Bright energy surrounded him. Sweat poured down his face. He gritted his teeth, then suddenly opened his eyes. His body trembled. His hands shook from the strain. He clenched his fists. Blue light filled the cave. Closing his eyes once more, he opened them again. His hair rose. His bones began rebuilding. His eyes widened. He realized his body had become stronger. Chung Myung looked down at his hands. He had not expected the pill's effects to be this powerful. Sweat poured down his skin, but he immediately realized it still was not enough. The remaining impurities inside his body were spreading through every part of him. The symbol of the sect rested on his clothes. His entire body felt as though his veins and cells were being stretched apart. His eyes widened. Something felt wrong. His heart was beating too fast. A sharp pressure formed in his body. Yellow energy flickered above him. Chung Myung realized that the energy erupting from the lower dantian had already broken through and reached the upper dantian. Energy flooded his body. He had completely lost control. Raising his hand, he instinctively tried to stop the flow. He grabbed his uniform and gritted his teeth. Then his expression changed. A memory surfaced. He remembered someone from the past. The bearded elder smiled and explained that a warrior tries to suppress and control, but a Taoist allows things to flow naturally. The river reflected sunlight. The waterfall surged endlessly. The elder once said that not everything in this world could be solved through logic. Under the red sky, he had told Chung Myung to stop resisting and allow everything to move naturally. People were also part of nature. Chung Myung slowly released his grip. He chose to trust the current. Blue light spread across his body. Floating in the air, circles appeared beneath his feet like ripples on water. He looked up. Before him stretched something that resembled enormous tree roots. Moving forward, he thought about the upper dantian. He walked across the water instinctively. Then he understood. Clenching his fists, he realized that the cracked wall ahead represented the entrance. He placed his hand on it. Closing his eyes, he listened. The crack glowed. Behind it pulsed overwhelming energy. Waves crashed endlessly. Sooner or later, they would break through. Touching the surface, he realized the situation was far more dangerous than expected. If he resisted, the wall would collapse. If he opened it forcefully, the waves would consume him. He looked forward, then remembered the elder's words. Trust the flow. Water only overflowed when someone tried to block it. Light gathered in front of his hand, then spread across the entire wall. Water moved beneath his feet. What once sounded like nonsense finally became clear. He looked upward. Water poured from an opening overhead. After 100 years, he finally understood the meaning behind that teaching. Every channel inside his body began shining. The orange sun rose. Chung Myung slowly opened one eye. He was floating inside the cave. Then he dropped to the ground. Looking around in confusion, he wondered why he had been suspended in the air. He stretched out his hand. Remembering the light, he clenched his fist. Every vital point in his body had opened completely. Looking at his palm, he realized something surprising. Even with this young body, he had survived. He could have gone insane. He could have died. Instead, he endured. Thinking of his teacher, he realized he had escaped disaster only because of that lesson. He stood, then concluded it had been worth it. Clenching his fist again, he smiled. His internal energy had grown. Standing in the middle of the cave, he looked ahead. Birds crossed the sky outside. He quietly thought that sometimes a person only understands after dying once. Walking forward, the words that once sounded meaningless now carried a different weight. He remembered his master's smile. The wind moved through his hair. He realized something. He had always thought of himself as only a swordsman, never a Taoist. Stepping out of the cave, he reflected that the essence of the sect had always been the coexistence of the sword and Taoism. Scratching the back of his head, Chung Myung quietly wondered, could someone like him really revive the sect? Chung Myung looked ahead. A yellow sky stretched above him. He decided that at this point, he needed to use every possible method. Opening the box again, he realized the remaining pills were no longer useful to him. Still smiling, he thought they could become valuable to someone else. Standing at the cave entrance, the Taoist decided it was finally time to return. Then he suddenly ran back inside. A moment later, he came out again. Several bottles of alcohol hung from his belt. Licking his lips, Chung Myung wondered what liquor preserved for 100 years would taste like. Standing there quietly, he realized how much the sect had changed. Only this place remained exactly as before. Turning around, he felt as if he had returned to the old days. He imagined his teacher smiling. The memory lingered. Bending his knees, he decided he should visit again. Then he leaped. His body shot into the air. Heading toward the cliff, he landed smoothly. Pushing off again, he rushed upward. A satisfied smile appeared. Jumping from one point to another, he climbed toward the summit. Pressing his foot against the rock, he launched himself into the air. Turning around, he saw the bright sun behind him. Then he dropped down. After brushing off his clothes, he realized his body felt unexpectedly light. Turning around, he quietly admitted this was not bad. Closing his eyes, he breathed in deeply. Then his eyes opened. His expression changed. Looking at the trees nearby, he suddenly shouted that he smelled something rotten. Later that night, the disciples finished training and opened the doors to leave. Most only wanted to collapse in a bed. Walking into the courtyard, some wondered how much longer this routine would continue. One rubbed his shoulder and complained that Chung Myung had been acting strangely lately. Another thought about it and realized he had not even appeared at training recently. Nearby, another disciple overheard the conversation. He mentioned that people had started saying Chung Myung looked thinner every day and seemed seriously unwell. Some believed he had become sick enough to stop training. Everyone turned. Looking toward the gate, someone quietly wondered if he was absent. Could training be skipped? Another disciple narrowed his eyes. His nervous companion asked whether there had ever been any other reason they obeyed him. After imagining Chung Myung's usual terrifying presence, they admitted the truth. Even if all of them attacked together, they would still lose. But now he looked weak. The atmosphere shifted. Standing in the courtyard, several students quietly started considering rebellion. Ghoul listened from the side as more voices joined in. Zhang smiled and told himself to leave those fools alone. With a sigh, he decided they would soon learn reality. Then the school gate opened. Zhang and Ghoul turned. Light spilled through the entrance. Someone walked in. It was Chung Myung. The students froze. His face had regained color. His condition looked completely restored. He seemed healthier than ever. Everyone immediately abandoned thoughts of rebellion. One look was enough. If they challenged him now, they would probably die. Chung Myung opened his mouth. Standing in front of everyone, he calmly admitted that as their instructor, he felt responsible. Because of his condition, he had missed their training. Lowering his head slightly, he said he could not ignore that mistake. The students immediately tried reassuring him. They insisted it was fine and that anyone could become sick. Chung Myung clenched his fist. He acknowledged that they had trained hard even without him, which made him feel even more responsible. Mistakes could not be erased, but they could be corrected. Since training had been insufficient, they would simply increase it. Then he pointed behind him, toward the enormous mountain. He announced the next exercise. A race. Anyone arriving late would run again. Zhang immediately sprinted away. Ghoul chased after him, complaining that nobody even explained anything. The remaining students stared. Then one suddenly shouted that everyone should run. If they were late, they would only suffer more. The entire courtyard froze in horror before breaking into a desperate sprint. A moment later, all the students rushed forward. Standing in the middle of the dust, Chung Myung watched them with a faint smile. So they had finally started thinking about rebellion. He did not dislike it. Before, they had only followed orders without question. Now, they at least had the courage to resist. His expression sharpened. Before complaining, people first needed ability. Looking at the disciples climbing the mountain, Chung Myung thought that a warrior earned the right to speak only after gaining strength, and then gaining even more. Watching them continue upward, he quietly decided to build that strength himself. Raising his head, he reflected that throughout thousands of years of Murim history, countless individuals had reached the peak alone. But one strong person could never restore an entire sect. Remembering his old companions, he realized that if only one disciple became exceptional, the sect's name would never truly rise again. Everyone had to grow stronger. Looking toward the sky again, Chung Myung decided that he would make the name of the sect echo louder than before. Standing alone in the courtyard, he shouted that whoever arrived last would lose their meal. Soon, the sun rose. Students collapsed across the yard. Ghoul lay on the ground, breathing heavily. Covered in sweat, he lifted his head and noticed Zhang standing. Even after that training, he remained upright, quietly wiping away sweat. Ghoul finally understood why Zhang was recognized as the eldest. It was not talent, it was will. Even Zhang himself trembled while standing. Then, a huge boulder dropped into the yard. Chung Myung appeared carrying more. He told everyone to hand over their sandbags. Seeing nobody move, he questioned why they were all lying down. Had they really exhausted themselves over something so small? Ghoul stared at him. Monster. Chung Myung narrowed his eyes and commented that the current generation seemed weak. Things had not been like that in his time. Jang, standing nearby, looked speechless. After dropping the boulders, Chung Myung announced that training would stop for now. Everyone should eat, then continue after lunch. Throwing aside the sandbags, he warned that if anyone skipped effort, the workload would increase tenfold. As he walked toward the gate, he ordered them to clean everything. Looking toward the mountain, many silently cursed him. Later, during breakfast, everyone sat around the table. Zhang looked around and asked why nobody was eating. One disciple raised his head and admitted that eating felt impossible. Another stood and asked whether training had become excessive. Even Zhang's hands were shaking. Everyone looked at their trembling hands and quietly admitted that they might actually collapse if this continued. Barely lifting his chopsticks, Zhang turned to Ghoul and asked what he thought. Holding a piece of meat, Ghoul thought quietly. Every day, the training became harsher. Their bodies might eventually fail. Many students nodded. Then Ghoul looked at Zhang. People were like iron. Iron only became stronger after enduring repeated strikes. Closing his eyes and imagining Chung Myung, he concluded that someone like him would never overlook such a basic truth. Opening his eyes again, Ghoul suggested they endure a little longer. If nothing improved, then they would speak up. Zhang nodded. The others looked relieved. He promised that when that day came, he would not stay silent. That night, Ghoul collapsed on his bed. He sighed and closed his eyes. Thinking about tomorrow's training, he wondered whether his body would give out first. Until now, he believed he could endure anything. But now he was not sure anymore. His eyes slowly closed. Then someone woke him. He opened his eyes. Chung Myung sat beside him with a faint smile and quietly told him not to make noise. Sitting there, Chung Myung explained that obtaining it had not been easy, but he would give it to him. Ghoul stood up in confusion. Then he looked at Chung Myung's hand. His eyes widened. Resting in Chung Myung's palm was a pill. Chung Myung raised a finger to his lips. Still shocked, Ghoul asked where he had gotten something so valuable and whether he really did not intend to use it himself. Ghoul froze when Chung Myung explained that he needed it more. Smiling, Chung Myung told him to keep everything secret from the others. Sitting behind him, he explained that after swallowing the pill, he would help circulate the energy. Ghoul closed his eyes. Quietly, he felt embarrassed remembering that he had once truly believed Chung Myung was a complete devil. Chung Myung placed his hand against his back. His storage of pills was now empty. But he already knew, if water was given to a thirsty person, that gratitude would remain forever. Grinning to himself, he imagined the elders' reactions and thought it might be interesting to watch. Night passed. The next morning, the students trained with their swords. Each swing came without complaint. Watching them, the instructor realized something had changed. His eyes widened. Their sword techniques had become stable. Every lunge matched perfectly. The students moved together. Looking carefully at their sword tips, he noticed sharper movements and greater confidence. Each step carried power. Their balance remained steady. Even the swords seemed heavier. The change was unbelievable for such a short time. As the students continued practicing in perfect rhythm, the teacher remembered Chung Myung asking him for only 1 month. Back then, he had confidently promised results. The teacher smiled. At first, he assumed this was simply the effect of morning training. Then his attention shifted. He noticed the disciple standing in the center. His expression changed. Placing his hands behind his back, he realized something else. The students' swords had not become empty movements. Their eyes still carried passion. The students stopped and looked up. The instructor smiled and announced that if they completed their current training properly, he was considering teaching them the Tai Flummox sword technique earlier than scheduled. The students immediately began murmuring among themselves. Excitement spread. The teacher smiled quietly. Effort rewarded effort. If this cycle continued, they would become worthy swordsmen. At that moment, the sect leader entered the training ground. Everyone turned. Calling Ungam aside, the sect leader explained that a problem had appeared. Handing him a book, he asked him to check the last page of the 6 interactions sword technique. Ungam opened it, then froze. His eyes widened and shouted in shock.